Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable, the past slows down, and science takes the scenic route through the older corners of the human story. Tonight's gentle journey carries us to a place that seems, at first glance, as if someone took the usual idea of an ancient city, turned it sideways, removed half the pieces, and then asked archaeologists to make sense of it over a cup of tea. We're going to the Konya Plain in central Turkey, to the remains of a vast Neolithic settlement called Çatalhöyük, often written in English as Çatalhöyük. A name that looks a little like a sleepy keyboard had a dream in Turkish, but belongs to one of the most important archaeological sites ever uncovered. It is old, deeply old, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the first cities of Mesopotamia, and yet when we look at it closely, it does not behave the way we expect an early civilization to behave. It had no obvious palace, no clear royal tombs, no grand streets lined with shops, no huge central temple rising above the houses to tell everyone where power lived. Instead, what we find is a dense maze of mud brick homes packed tightly together, many entered from the roof, with people moving across the tops of buildings rather than along streets below. UNESCO describes the site as exceptional for its long life, its back-to-back houses with roof access, and its rich evidence of wall paintings, reliefs, and symbolic life inside the homes themselves. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere quiet with the lights low and the evening settling in? Are you hearing this from a city apartment, a village road, a room with a tired plant in the corner, or perhaps while half pretending you're not about to fall asleep? And if you were to imagine an ancient settlement, what would you expect to see first? A wall maybe, a gate, a market street, a king's house, some official-looking building where important people did important things and probably made everyone else wait outside. That is the comfortable picture we often carry in our minds when we think about early civilization. We imagine people slowly gathering into villages, then villages growing into towns, then towns becoming cities, and somewhere along the way, leaders appear, temples rise, roads get planned, and someone invents paperwork, which may or may not have been humanity's first great mistake. But Çatalhöyük sits in that story like a quiet question mark made of clay. It is not that it lacks complexity. Far from it. It is complex in ways that are strangely intimate. The mystery is not that these people were simple. The mystery is that they seem organized, symbolic, settled, skilled, and socially connected, without leaving behind many of the things we usually associate with organized life. If you find this kind of slow journey into the deep human past soothing, intriguing, or just a pleasant way to let the day loosen its grip, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this quiet little place reach other curious minds who might also enjoy wandering through ancient dust at a gentle pace. And don't worry, we will not be rushing. Çatalhöyük has waited more than 9,000 years to be understood. It can wait a few more minutes while we settle in properly. Now, when archaeologists talk about Çatalhöyük, they are not talking about a single building or a little scatter of huts. They are talking about a large, long-lived settlement made of layers upon layers of human occupation. The official site history places its Neolithic occupation mainly between about 7,100 and 5,950 BCE, which means people were living, cooking, sleeping, working, burying their dead, repainting their walls, rebuilding their homes, and sweeping their floors there for well over 1,000 years. That is a difficult amount of time to picture. 1,000 years is long enough for languages to change, stories to blur, customs to evolve, and for people to forget exactly why great-grandparents did things a certain way while still doing them anyway because, well, that is how the house is supposed to be plastered. Imagine a place where generation after generation lives not by spreading outward in neat streets, but by building again and again on the same spot. Old walls are filled in, new walls rise above them, floors are remade, rooms are cleaned, Bodies are placed beneath platforms and life continues upward. Over time, the settlement becomes a mound, not because someone decided to build a hill, but because living itself slowly made one. It is a hill made of houses, ash, memory, plaster, bones, baskets, hearths, and all the ordinary things that become archaeology when enough time passes. That may be the first thing that makes Çatalhöyük feel slightly uncanny. It was not a city in the later sense, not a place with avenues, districts, and monuments laid out for visitors to admire. It grew more like a living organism. The houses pressed against one another so closely that there were often no streets between them. The Çatalhöyük research project describes the houses as roughly rectangular, closely built together, and entered by wooden ladders through openings in the ceilings, with people moving around on the roofs. This means that daily life may have unfolded above the rooms as much as inside them. The roofs were not simply roofs. They were walkways, workspaces, meeting places, and perhaps the closest thing the settlement had to public space. Try to imagine that for a moment, not too dramatically, just practically. You wake in a mud brick room. The air smells faintly of plaster, smoke, stored grain, and yesterday's cooking. Light comes down from the opening above. Someone moves across the roof overhead. You climb a ladder to step out, not into a lane, but onto a broad, uneven landscape of rooftops, with other people emerging from other openings like neighbours appearing from little square wells. Children move carefully from roof to roof. Dogs linger near food scraps. Smoke rises from hearths. Someone repairs a wall. Someone else shapes clay, grinds grain, or carries a basket. There is no street corner in the usual sense, no front door to knock on. To visit someone, you might cross over the roof and descend into their house from above, which is charming until you imagine doing it while carrying soup. The strangeness of this is not only architectural, it changes how we think about privacy, community, movement, and even danger. In a street-based town, walls separate private homes from public paths. At Çatalhöyük, the boundary feels different. The roofs connected households. The entrance to the home came from above. Smoke escaped through the same opening people used to enter and leave. A house was not a sealed box with a polite front step. It was part of a thick social fabric, where the roofscape may have been lively and shared while the interior remained deeply personal. And inside those interiors, the story becomes even more unusual. These homes were not bare shelters. Many had plastered walls and floors, raised platforms, hearths, ovens, storage spaces, and sometimes elaborate painted or modelled features. UNESCO notes the presence of a large assemblage of wall paintings and reliefs that help reveal the symbolic world of the inhabitants. In other words, art and ritual were not locked away in separate temples where only specialists could access them. Much of the symbolic life appears to have taken place inside houses. That point is worth sitting with quietly because it changes the mood of the whole site. At many later settlements, archaeologists can point to a palace or a temple and say, "Here is the centre of authority. Here is where the official rituals happened. Here is where power gathered itself into stone." At Çatalhöyük, the house itself seems to have carried much of that meaning. People cooked there, slept there, made things there, remembered there, and in many cases buried their dead there. The domestic and the sacred were not separate rooms in the human mind. They were under the same roof and sometimes under the same floor. The burials are one of the details that gently unsettles modern assumptions. At Çatalhöyük, many people were buried beneath the floors of houses, often under platforms where the living continued to move, rest and work. The evidence for burials inside occupied buildings is strong enough that recent research continues to explore how human remains were connected to the life histories of buildings themselves, not simply placed away from the settlement in a separate cemetery. To us, this may feel startling. We are used to separating the living from the dead with gates, cemeteries, rituals of distance, and a certain amount of landscaping. But at Çatalhöyük, ancestors were part of the household environment. The dead were not always sent away. They remained near, beneath the clean plastered surfaces of daily life. A child might grow up above the bones of relatives. A meal might be prepared a few steps from a burial. A house might carry not just a family's belongings, but its remembered people. And because houses were rebuilt again and again, the connection between home, body and memory may have shaped the identity of each building over many generations. This is where the title of our journey begins to make sense. Çatalhöyük does not make sense if we expect civilization to begin with kings and streets and official buildings. It does make a kind of sense if we allow that early settled life may have experimented with forms of community very different from our own. It asks us to loosen our grip on the usual ladder of progress, the one where humanity climbs from simple huts to villages, from villages to towns, from towns to cities, and from cities to bureaucratic meetings that could have been handled with a small clay token and a nod. Çatalhöyük reminds us that people did not become complex because they suddenly discovered hierarchy. They could become complex through shared practices, household traditions, symbolic interiors, repeated building, food production, trade, craft, ritual and memory. Complexity does not always need a throne room. Sometimes it sits beside the hearth, under a layer of white plaster, while someone tries to keep the smoke moving out through the ceiling hole. It is also important to be careful with words. People often call Çatalhöyük a city, sometimes even one of the world's first cities, but archaeologists tend to be more cautious. It was certainly large and densely settled for its time. It was certainly important. But it lacks some of the features we normally associate with later urban life, such as clear public administration, monumental architecture, or obvious central institutions. The UNESCO nomination material notes that the site has not shown evidence of large public buildings, ceremonial centres, specialised production areas, or separate cemeteries in the way one might expect from later towns. That absence is not a failure of Çatalhöyük. It is the puzzle. It means that people were living in a big, long-lasting, socially rich community without leaving behind the usual archaeological signposts of rulers, priests and planners. Either they organised themselves differently, or their centres of authority were so embedded in ordinary life that they do not look like authority to us. And maybe that is why the site feels so modern and so alien at the same time. On one hand, the people of Çatalhöyük were doing things we understand immediately. They made homes, they cooked food, they cared for children, they repaired walls, they decorated rooms, they remembered the dead, they dealt with neighbours, which has always been one of humanity's most delicate arts. On the other hand, they did these things within a settlement that challenges our instincts. No streets, roof entrances, burials beneath floors, symbolic art inside ordinary houses, a large community without obvious kings. It is not difficult because it is primitive. It is difficult because it is unfamiliar. Even the landscape adds to the feeling. Today, the site lies on the Konya Plain, a wide area of central Anatolia, but in the Neolithic period the environment would have offered wetlands, resources, animals, plants, and seasonal rhythms that shaped how people lived. Çatalhöyük was not isolated from nature in the way a modern city tries to be. It was tied closely to surrounding fields, marshes, animals, clay, reeds, timber, and distant sources of stone and materials. The people there were part farmers, part herders, part foragers, part makers, part observers of an animal world that appears again and again in their art. Bulls, wild cattle, vultures, leopards, and other creatures enter the imagery of the site, not as simple decoration, but as signs of a symbolic life we still cannot fully translate. We can describe the paintings, the reliefs, and the installations. We can measure walls and analyse pigments, but the meaning, the feeling, the story told inside those rooms remains partly out of reach. Archaeology can show us the marks on the wall. It cannot always tell us what someone felt when they stood before them in firelight. That gap between evidence and meaning is one of the reasons Çatalhöyük is so good for a slow night's thinking. It gives us facts, but not too many easy answers. There is enough material to build a rich picture, and enough mystery to keep the mind wandering gently from room to room. We know that houses were rebuilt. We know that some walls were painted. We know that people entered from above. We know that bodies were buried beneath floors. We know that the settlement lasted for centuries upon centuries. We know that it has been studied intensely, from the early excavations of James Mellart in the 1960s to later long-term research associated with Ian Hodder and many teams of specialists. But even after all that work, Çatalhöyük still resists being reduced to a simple label. It's not quite a village, not quite a city, not quite a temple complex, not quite an egalitarian dream, not quite a mystery cult, not quite anything that fits neatly into one museum caption. It is Çatalhöyük, which is rather inconsiderate of it, but also what makes it fascinating. So tonight we will approach it slowly, not as a lost world of fantasy, and not as a place that proves some dramatic secret about ancient aliens, vanished super-civilizations, or prehistoric people with suspiciously advanced interior design. We do not need any of that. The real site is strange enough. A community of humans living around 9,000 years ago created a settlement so dense that rooftops became pathways, so intimate that the dead rested beneath the floors, so symbolically rich that house walls became places of imagery and memory, and so socially unusual that even after decades of excavation, scholars still debate how it worked. That is more than enough wonder for one evening, and as we begin, it may help to set aside the idea that the past is a straight road leading neatly toward us. The people of Çatalhöyük were not early versions of modern city dwellers waiting to become sensible. They were not failed Mesopotamians who forgot to invent streets. They were people living in a world of their own, making choices that worked for them for an astonishingly long time. Their settlement grew not like a planned capital, but like a layered household world, where architecture, memory, ritual, and daily labour were woven tightly together. To understand them, we have to be willing to climb down through the roof rather than walk in through the front door. So settle in, slow your thoughts, and let the modern world soften around the edges for a while. Somewhere beneath the dust of central Anatolia lies a settlement that seems to ask a very simple question in a very old language. What if civilization did not begin the way we thought it did? And to answer that, we first have to walk out onto the plain, toward the mound itself, and look at the quiet rise in the earth where thousands of lives were stacked one above another, not in stone towers or royal monuments, but in mud brick rooms filled with smoke, plaster, footsteps, sleeping bodies, remembered ancestors, and the patient remains of a town that still refuses to behave. To understand why Çatalhöyük feels so strange, it helps to begin not with the houses, the burials, or the painted walls, but with the ground itself. Because before it was an archaeological site, before it was a name on a UNESCO list, before scholars leaned over its layers with brushes, notebooks, cameras, and the serious expression of people trying not to admit that a pile of ancient mud brick has completely rearranged their assumptions. It was simply a rise in the earth, a mound on the Konya plain. Not a mountain, not a fortress, not a monument built to impress travellers from far away. Just a low, wide swelling in the landscape, sitting quietly in central Anatolia, holding inside it thousands upon thousands of ordinary human decisions. UNESCO describes Çatalhöyük as two hills forming a 37-hectare site on the southern Anatolian plateau, with the taller eastern mound preserving 18 levels of Neolithic occupation, and the western mound preserving later Chalcolithic occupation. And that may sound neat enough in a sentence, but in reality it means something far more intimate. It means that people lived there, left traces, rebuilt, returned, adapted, and repeated the pattern for so long that their settlement slowly became part of the geography. A mound like Çatalhöyük is not made in a day, or even in a lifetime. It forms through the patient accumulation of living. Walls collapse, new walls are raised, floors are replastered, roofs are repaired, ovens are cleaned out, ashes swept away, or sometimes not swept quite as far as someone intended. Rooms are filled in, Rooms are rebuilt, rooms are remembered, and then new rooms are placed above them. The ground rises not because anyone set out to build a hill, but because generation after generation stayed. This is one of the quietest and most remarkable things about ancient settlements in the Near East and Anatolia. They can become tells, or höyüks, mounds of human occupation, where the archaeology is not spread across the surface like a scattered picnic, but stacked downward in layers. To excavate such a place is not simply to dig into dirt. It is to move backward through lives piled on top of lives, through homes resting on earlier homes, through moments that were once urgent and are now compressed into the soil. Somewhere there, between a floor and the floor beneath it, a family's present became someone else's foundation. The modern visitor arriving at Çatalhöyük might expect drama from the landscape, but the Konya Plain offers a quieter sort of presence. It is broad, open and spacious, the kind of place where the horizon has plenty of room to think. The site lies southeast of the modern city of Konya, in what is now Turkey, and today the surrounding land is largely agricultural, worked, managed, and crossed by roads and fields. But the Neolithic world around the mound was not simply the dry plain one might picture from the present. The ancient environment was more varied, more changeable, and more closely tied to water. Research into the landscape around Çatalhöyük suggests that the settlement stood within the wider alluvial world of the Çarşamba River, with channels, wetlands, drier patches, and shifting resources shaping how people lived there. This matters because the choice of where to settle is never random, even if later archaeologists occasionally wish ancient people had left a helpful note explaining their reasoning. The Konya Plain was not just an empty stage waiting for civilization to wander on. It was a living environment, full of advantages and inconveniences. Water brought fertility, reeds, birds, fish, clay, grazing, and useful seasonal resources. It also brought damp ground, mosquitoes, mud, floods, and the sort of practical household problems that rarely appear in grand theories of civilization, but absolutely matter if you're trying to keep your floor clean. A settlement built near wetlands could draw on a rich mixture of foods and materials. People could farm, herd, hunt, gather, fish, cut reeds, collect clay, and move through different zones as seasons changed. That kind of environmental variety may help explain why a large community could remain there for so long. It was not simply that they found a good place and stayed. It was that the place offered options, and for early farmers, options were a form of security. It is tempting to imagine the first settlers arriving with a plan, standing on a small rise and saying, "Yes, this seems like a fine location for one of the most puzzling archaeological sites in the world." More likely the beginning was practical, a slightly raised patch of ground, access to water, nearby resources, soil that could support cultivation somewhere within reach, animals moving through the landscape, clay suitable for building, reeds and timber available enough for roof beams, mats, baskets, and daily tools. The earliest houses would not yet have been buried beneath a mound of memory. They would have stood closer to the surface of the plain, small in number compared with what came later. Their people busy with food, repairs, children, smoke, illness, arguments, weather, and all the ordinary business that never thinks of itself as history. No one living there in the beginning could have known that the place would endure for so many centuries. Most people do not wake up and think, "Today I am participating in the formation of a future World Heritage Site." They think, "Where did I put that basket?" Or, "Who let the goat near the grain again?" Over time, though, staying changed everything. The East Mound rose through repeated Neolithic occupation, while the West Mound later carried life into the Chalcolithic period. The Çatalhöyük research project explains that occupation on the West Mound began later than on the East, and continued after the East Mound was deserted, with the area between the mounds today occupied by fields, but possibly once associated with the course of the Çarşamba River. This means Çatalhöyük is not just one mound with one story. It is a landscape of continuity and change. The eastern mound holds the famous dense Neolithic town, the place of roof entry, wall paintings, burials beneath floors, and tightly packed houses. The western mound tells of later practices, changing pottery, shifting habits, and a community that remained connected to the place while no longer living exactly as its predecessors had. The mounds are close enough to feel related, yet different enough to remind us that cultures do not freeze in time. They continue, adjust, forget, borrow, and sometimes move a few hundred meters away, which is perhaps the archaeological version of changing apartments while still staying in the same neighbourhood. The very word Höyük is important here. It tells us that Çatalhöyük is a mound formed by occupation, not a natural hill that people merely used. The Turkish name is often explained as meaning something like fork mound, with Çatal referring to a fork or branching form, and Höyük referring to a mound. Even the name seems to point toward a landscape shaped by division, branching, and accumulation. But the mound itself is not symbolic in any mysterious sense before people made it so. It is physical. Mud brick is vulnerable. It erodes. It melts back into earth when rain and time have their say. A mud brick wall does not survive like a granite temple unless it is buried, protected, or repeatedly maintained. This is one of the strange gifts of Çatalhöyük. Because people kept rebuilding, and because later layers covered earlier ones, much of the settlement became sealed inside itself. Its fragility helped preserve it. The houses survived not because they were indestructible, but because they were eventually covered by other houses, like letters tucked inside envelopes made of clay. When archaeologists first began to study the site in the 20th century, they were not simply opening a forgotten village, they were opening a vertical archive. The Çatalhöyük research project records that the site was encountered by British archaeologists David French, Alan Hall, and James Mellart in 1958, and that Mellart's excavations from 1961 to 1965 revealed houses, figurines, pottery and wall art that quickly made the site famous. This early work brought Çatalhöyük into global attention because it seemed too rich, too large, and too symbolically complex for the tidy expectations people often had about the Neolithic. Here was a settlement from long before writing in the region, long before metal tools became central, long before the famous Bronze Age kingdoms, and yet it contained elaborate imagery, dense architecture, and a social world that clearly had rules, traditions, and depth. The mound had looked quiet from outside. Inside, it was busy with evidence. Imagine being one of those early excavators, cutting into a mound that local people already knew as part of the landscape, and realizing that the soil is not merely soil. One line of plaster appears, then another, a floor, a platform, a hearth, a wall painting, a buried body, horn cores from wild cattle, a room that had once been cleaned, repaired, and lived in, another beneath it, then another. The mound begins to behave less like a hill and more like a library where every book has been pressed flat and written in mud. This is part of the emotional power of tell archaeology. From a distance it can seem unimpressive, a swelling in a field. A dusty rise. Nothing like the pyramids, nothing like the Acropolis, nothing like a stone circle catching the sunset. But once you understand what made it, the mound becomes almost overwhelming. It is not an object placed in the landscape. It is the landscape after humans have lived in it for a very long time. The plain around Çatalhöyük also reminds us that ancient life was never sealed inside the settlement. The houses may draw our attention, but the people moved outward constantly. They farmed fields, gathered plants, managed animals, collected raw materials, and watched the seasons. The site's relationship with the Çarşamba River and its alluvial fan is especially important because water shape both opportunity and risk. Rivers in such landscapes do not always behave like polite blue lines on a map. They shift, split, silt up, flood, and leave behind channels that may be active in one generation and abandoned in another. A river can be a road, a resource, a boundary, a nuisance, and a neighbour with unreliable manners. If the river shifted over the centuries, that would have affected where people farmed, where they walked, where they found clay, where animals grazed, and perhaps even why later occupation favoured the west mound rather than the east. There is a useful humility in thinking about this. We often talk about ancient settlements as if people chose a location once and then history unfolded. But a place is not stable just because it stays on a map. Wetlands expand and shrink, channels move, soils change, wood becomes harder or easier to obtain, fields become tired, social relationships shift, children grow up and inherit habits that no longer perfectly fit the conditions that created them. The people of Çatalhöyük were not living in a static postcard of the Neolithic. They were adapting to a changing world, probably in small ways most of the time and occasionally in larger ways that would have been discussed, debated, resisted, and then remembered as the way things are now. That phrase, incidentally, has probably been annoying older people for at least 9,000 years. The mound itself would have changed appearance across its long life. In its earlier phases, it was a settlement on the plain. Later, as buildings accumulated, it became a raised place. Eventually, after abandonment, weather softened its edges. Mud brick decayed, walls slumped, plaster broke down, plants grew. Later communities may have used or noticed the mound without fully knowing what lay beneath. The Çatalhöyük research project notes that different communities use the site almost continuously from the Neolithic into the present, which means the mound did not simply disappear from human awareness after the famous settlement ended. This is another reminder that archaeological sites have more than one life. There is the life of the original inhabitants, then the life of abandonment, then the life of later use, local memory, survey, excavation, tourism, conservation, and interpretation. A place can be ancient and still be changing. By the time modern archaeology returned in a sustained way under Ian Hodder in the 1990s, the mound had become not only a site of discovery but a site of method. Researchers did not just want to find spectacular objects. They wanted to understand how the settlement worked at every scale, from architecture and burial to diet, craft, landscape, symbolism, and daily practice. The excavation history itself reflects a shift in archaeology, from treasure-seeking narratives towards slower, more detailed reconstruction. That is appropriate for Çatalhöyük because its mystery is not best answered by one golden object or one dramatic inscription. There are no royal tablets saying, "I, king of roof ladders, command this town." Instead, the evidence is distributed through houses, floors, bones, seeds, plaster, pigments, tools, and the spaces between them. The mound does not give up its meaning in one grand reveal. It releases it reluctantly in fragments, like someone telling a story while half asleep. The Konya Plain also places Çatalhöyük within a wider Neolithic world. It was not alone in the broad story of early farming, settlement, and social change. Across Southwest Asia and Anatolia, communities were experimenting with new ways of living, cultivating plants, managing animals, building more permanent architecture, forming larger social groups, and developing new ritual practices. But Çatalhöyük stands out because of the scale and preservation of its evidence. It gives us a rare chance to see an early settled community not as a simple stepping stone toward later civilization, but as a sophisticated world in its own right. The mound says, in effect, do not rush past me on the way to Mesopotamia. Do not treat me as a rough draft just because I do not have kings. There is a complete human experiment here, one that lasted longer than many states and empires that came after it. And what a peculiar experiment it was. A dense settlement without streets rising from a wetland landscape. Houses entered from above, rooms kept clean and carefully arranged, burials placed beneath floors, art inside domestic spaces. A community large enough to require coordination, yet without obvious palaces or temples dominating the mound. All of that grows more understandable when we first picture the place as a mound, because the mound is the result of repetition. People were not merely occupying space, they were returning to specific spaces, rebuilding specific forms, maintaining traditions that linked households across time. In a stone city, power often announces itself upward through towers, walls, gates and monuments. At Çatalhöyük, meaning seems to have accumulated downward and inward. The deeper you go, the more you find. This is why the mound on the Konya plain is not just the setting for the story, it is part of the story's argument. Çatalhöyük challenges us because it does not present civilization as a sudden leap into public grandeur. It presents it as density, memory, labour, household continuity, and a stubborn commitment to place. It suggests that one of humanity's great transformations may have happened not with a king standing on a platform, but with families rebuilding floors above older floors, with neighbours crossing rooftops, with smoke drifting across a settlement that had no streets, with the dead resting beneath the living, and with a mound slowly rising because people kept choosing to remain. There is something almost comforting in that, though not sentimental. The mound is evidence of endurance, but also of maintenance. Staying is work. A settled life is not simply a peaceful life. Mud brick walls need repair, food must be stored, waste must be managed, animals must be dealt with, neighbours must be tolerated, which is a major technological achievement in any age. Children must be taught where to climb, where not to step, what to touch, what to leave alone, and which roof opening belongs to which house, because getting that wrong could make for an awkward morning. Over centuries, all of these small acts produced the mound, not one great decision, thousands of ordinary ones. So as we stand, in the mind's eye, before the east mound of Çatalhöyük, it is worth letting go of the expectation that ancient importance must look dramatic from the outside. Some places shout, this one murmurs. It does not rise like a pyramid or glitter like a palace wall. It waits as a long, low memory in the plain, and beneath that memory are layers of human life so dense that each handful of soil seems to ask for patience. The mound is not only where Çatalhöyük happened, it is what Çatalhöyük became, a settlement turned into earth, a community turned into stratigraphy. 1,000 years of mornings, meals, repairs, rituals, births, deaths, and quiet rooftop crossings compressed into a hill that still, after all this time, has not finished explaining itself. And once we understand that, we can begin to move closer, not just toward the mound as a shape in the landscape, but into the settlement itself, where the usual map of a town begins to fail us almost immediately. Because when we imagine walking into an ancient community, we expect a path, we expect an entrance, we expect a street. But at Çatalhöyük, the houses press together so tightly that the ground-level world does not welcome us in the usual way, and the town seems to say, with great Neolithic calm, that if we wish to enter, we may have to climb. The closer we move toward Çatalhöyük, the more our ordinary sense of a town begins to misbehave. We are used to settlements that introduce themselves politely. A road leads in. A gate or opening suggests where strangers should enter. Streets divide one block from another. Houses present their fronts to the world, with doors facing outward, as if each building is saying in its own quiet architectural language, this is where you knock. Even very old villages often leave behind some trace of paths, lanes, courtyards, or open spaces where people and animals could pass through at ground level. Çatalhöyük does something else entirely. It gives us a packed mass of mud brick buildings pressed so closely together that the settlement seems less like a town with streets and more like a honeycomb made for humans, smoke, storage baskets, sleeping platforms, and the occasional person trying not to step into the wrong roof opening before breakfast. This is one of the first details that makes Çatalhöyük so difficult to picture clearly. The houses were not arranged along streets in the way we expect. They were built directly against one another, wall to wall, forming dense clusters where movement at ground level would have been limited or, in many places, almost impossible. To enter many homes, people appear to have used ladders leading down through openings in the roof. That means the roof was not simply the top of the house. It was part of the town's circulation system. It was a walkway, a working surface, a place to meet, a place to repair things, maybe a place to dry food, sort materials, talk with neighbours, watch children, and keep an eye on whatever was happening across the roofscape. Where we imagine streets, Çatalhöyük offers rooftops. Where we imagine front doors, it offers ceiling holes. It is a small adjustment in architecture, but it produces a very different world. Try to slow the image down. You're not walking through narrow streets with walls on either side. You are crossing a broad, uneven spread of rooftops. Some are higher than others because buildings were rebuilt at different times and perhaps not all maintained in exactly the same way. The surface beneath your feet is plaster, reed, mud brick, packed earth, wood, and whatever repairs have recently been made by someone who may or may not have been very pleased about doing it. Smoke rises from openings. Voices come from below. A ladder leans into a house. Somewhere grain is being carried in a basket. Somewhere else a child is being told to move away from the edge, probably for the third time that morning. If you want to visit another household, you do not follow a street to their door. You cross the roofs and climb down. The settlement is not entered from the side. It is entered from above. There is something wonderfully practical about this, and also slightly alarming if you have ever tried to climb down a ladder while holding anything fragile. Roof entry may have helped with security, insulation, space management, and the close packing of buildings. A town without streets can fit more houses into a given area. It can keep outer walls continuous and perhaps easier to defend or control. It can make use of roof surfaces in a landscape where open space inside the settlement was precious. But it also means daily life required a kind of bodily familiarity with architecture that most of us do not have. People would have known where to step, which roof belonged to which household, which openings to avoid, where smoke might sting the eyes, where a surface was weak, and which neighbour would be annoyed if you crossed too close to their work area. A street-based town teaches you to walk between buildings. Çatalhöyük taught people to walk over them. Inside the houses, the arrangement was usually more ordered than the outside might suggest. Many of the buildings followed a similar basic pattern. A main room, often with platforms along the walls, a hearth or oven area, storage spaces, and smaller side rooms or bins for food and materials. The interiors were plastered, maintained, and often carefully cleaned. The walls and floors were not rough backdrops to life. They were worked surfaces, repeatedly replastered, sometimes painted, sometimes modelled into shapes, sometimes repaired over and over again. This repeated plastering matters because it tells us the houses were not treated casually. A wall could be renewed, a floor could be refreshed, a platform could be kept clean. The home was a structure that required attention, and attention leaves a signature. The rooms would have been small by modern standards, but they were not primitive in the lazy sense that word is often used. They were specialised, lived in, and practical. People cooked, stored grain, prepared food, slept, worked, and gathered inside them. The hearth and oven were usually placed near the roof opening, which makes sense if smoke needed somewhere to go, although anyone who has sat near a smoky fire knows that smoke is a substance with opinions of its own. It does not always move where one politely asks it to. Experiments and studies of house interiors suggest that smoke, soot, and ventilation would have been real parts of life. Roof openings gave light and air, but they also meant that the same entrance used by humans served as the exit route for smoke. So the house was not a sealed, cosy box. It was a breathing space with warmth, light, ash, smells, and the constant maintenance required by fire. The main room often seems to have been the centre of household life. Raised platforms may have been used for sitting, sleeping, working, and, as we will soon see, much more complicated forms of memory. Some areas were kept cleaner than others. Dirty work, food preparation, ash disposal, and storage had their places. The layout suggests routines, and routines are one of the clearest ways archaeology lets us see people without hearing them speak. A pot found near a hearth is not just a pot. It hints at repeated meals. A grinding stone is not just a tool. It points to hours of labour, the sound of grain being crushed, the ache in shoulders and hands, the daily work that turns plants into food. A plastered platform is not just a raised surface. It may be a sleeping place, a family area, a place of display, a place connected to the dead, or all of these at different moments. One of the most interesting things about Çatalhöyük is how similar many of the houses appear to be. There are differences, of course. Some houses were more elaborately decorated, some contained more burials, some had more evidence of rebuilding or special treatment. But there is no obvious palace, no grand mansion towering above the rest, no wealthy district separated from a poor district by a polite but unmistakable line. The settlement does not show social difference in the way later cities often do, where elite houses, administrative buildings, storage centres, and temples stand out clearly from ordinary homes. At Çatalhöyük, the basic household form is repeated again and again. That does not prove everyone was equal in every way. Human beings are extremely talented at producing subtle differences even when architecture refuses to cooperate. But it does suggest that social organisation was not built around the same visible hierarchies we see in many later urban societies. This is part of why the honeycomb image is useful, though like all comparisons it has limits. A honeycomb is dense, modular, and efficient. Each cell is separate but connected to the whole. Çatalhöyük's houses were individual spaces, yet physically locked into a larger mass. The wall of one house might be the wall of another. The roof of one building might be a route to several more. No household was fully isolated because the architecture itself made isolation difficult. At the same time, each house had its own interior order, its own platform arrangements, its own history of plastering, rebuilding and burial. The settlement was not one big communal hall, nor was it a loose scattering of independent huts. It was something in between, private interiors joined into a public roofscape. That arrangement must have shaped social life in ways we can only partly reconstruct. Privacy would not have worked exactly as it does for us. If the entrance to your house is on the roof, then people above you are always potentially near your doorway. Sounds travel. Smoke travels. Smells certainly travel, often with unnecessary confidence. Neighbours would know a great deal about one another simply because the settlement was so compact. At the same time, the descent into a house may have created a strong sense of entering a household world. From the busy roof surface, you climb down into a room where light falls from above, walls are plastered, platforms line the space, and certain features may carry meanings known mostly to the people who belong there. The roof may have been more public. The interior may have been more intimate. Instead of front and back, Çatalhöyük may have organised life through above and below. This vertical way of living makes the town feel almost upside down to modern imagination. In most settlements, the ground is the shared level, and rooftops are private or secondary. Here, the ground between houses was often unavailable, and rooftops became the shared surface. It would have changed the way children learned the settlement. A child in a street town learns routes by corners, doors and lanes. A child at Çatalhöyük may have learned routes by roof edges, ladders, openings, smoke holes, height changes and familiar surfaces underfoot. The map of the town would not be drawn as lines between buildings, but as paths over them. Perhaps people did not think of the settlement as we do, as blocks and streets. Perhaps they thought in terms of households, roof routes, kin relations and remembered buildings. Go to the house beyond the place where the roof dips, not turn left at the second lane. It is not as tidy, but then again, neither are most human directions. Even today, people still say things like, "It's near the old shop that isn't there anymore," which would probably make perfect sense at Çatalhöyük. The lack of streets also raises practical questions about waste, animals, and movement. In later towns, streets are not just pathways. They're places where refuse accumulates, where animals pass, where water runs, where strangers enter, where goods are transported, where public life becomes visible. At Çatalhöyük, much of that had to be handled differently. Trash and ash were often deposited in external midden areas, especially around the edges of buildings or open spaces where refuse could accumulate. Roofs may have been used to move goods, but large animals probably did not wander through the settlement in the way they might in a street village. The tight architecture may have separated human interiors from livestock more sharply, or at least organised the relationship differently. If you have ever watched a goat attempt to go somewhere it has not been invited, you may appreciate the value of architecture that discourages casual animal traffic. The houses themselves were built largely of mud brick, a humble material with a remarkable history. Mud brick is not glamorous, it does not sparkle, and it rarely gets invited to star in documentaries unless something very old has happened to it. But it is practical, local, and well suited to many ancient environments. Clay-rich earth can be shaped into bricks, dried in the sun, and used to build walls that insulate against heat and cold. Mud brick architecture requires upkeep, but it also allows rebuilding and modification. A house can be repaired, extended, closed, filled, and remade with materials close at hand. At Çatalhöyük, the repeated use of mud brick helped create the mound itself. Buildings rose, decayed, were filled in, and became foundations for later buildings. The material life of the settlement was cyclical. Earth became brick, brick became wall, wall became ruin, ruin became ground, ground became the base for another wall. This process gives the town a very different feeling from a stone city. Stone monuments often aim for permanence. Mud brick houses accept that maintenance and rebuilding are part of life. The people of Çatalhöyük did not need to create an immortal facade. Their architecture was durable enough to live in, flexible enough to renew, and meaningful enough to rebuild in place. That last point is important. If houses were simply disposable shelters, people might have moved them more easily. But at Çatalhöyük, many buildings were rebuilt on earlier building footprints, suggesting that place mattered. Not just the general location of the settlement, but the specific location of a house. The home was not only a container for life, it was a continuing address in a community that may have remembered households through architecture. The repeated rebuilding also means that a house at Çatalhöyük could have a biography. It could be born, used, cleaned, decorated, altered, filled with burials, closed and rebuilt. Some buildings may have held special status because of their histories, not because they were bigger in the obvious sense. A house with many burials, repeated symbolic features, or elaborate wall treatments may have been remembered differently from one with fewer such traces. In a society without obvious palaces, power or importance may have been attached to lineage, ritual knowledge, household continuity, or control over certain memories. That is not easy to prove, but it is a useful way to think about why some buildings seem more symbolically charged than others. At Çatalhöyük, importance may have lived inside the house rather than above it. This is one of the reasons the settlement resists simple categories. Was it a village? It was too large and dense for the simplest version of that word. Was it a city? It lacks the streets, public buildings, administrative centres, and visible hierarchy we often expect from cities. Was it a ritual centre? The ritual evidence is strong, but it is embedded in domestic architecture rather than separated into monumental temples. Was it egalitarian? Maybe in some ways, though not necessarily in all. It is best to let it remain slightly awkward. Archaeology becomes more honest when it admits that ancient people did not organise themselves for the convenience of modern labels. The honeycomb arrangement also affects how we imagine sound. A street town has sound corridors, footsteps, animals, carts, voices and tools echo along lanes. At Çatalhöyük, sound may have risen and spread across roofs, or remained contained inside thick-walled rooms. Inside a house, the noise of grinding grain could continue for long periods. Fire crackled, people talked, infants cried, tools struck bone, wood, stone, or clay. Above, feet crossed the roof. A ladder creaked. Someone called across an opening. The settlement was dense but not necessarily loud in the same way a later market town might be. Its activity was distributed across interiors and rooftops, not gathered into streets. The rhythm of the place would have been built from domestic work repeated hundreds of times in close proximity. Smell too would have been part of the architecture. Smoke from hearths, fresh plaster, stored grain, cooking food, animal products, human bodies, damp clay, ash, refuse from midden areas. The scent of a settlement is rarely preserved, which is probably a mercy in some cases, but it shaped experience. A person at Çatalhöyük would have known home partly through smell. The roofscape in the morning with smoke lifting from many openings would have been as distinctive as any skyline. We tend to imagine ancient sites visually because that is what survives, but daily life was not silent, odourless, or neatly lit. It was full-bodied and practical. Light inside the houses would have been limited. The roof opening provided daylight, and fire added warmth and flicker, but many interiors must have been dim compared with the open plain outside. That dimness matters when we think about wall paintings and reliefs. A painted animal on a plastered wall would not have been seen under museum lighting, evenly illuminated and labelled with a small card. It may have appeared in shifting light, partly obscured by smoke, emerging as the eye adjusted. The house interior was not a gallery, but an inhabited place. Art shared the room with ovens, platforms, tools, food, dust, bodies, and ordinary chores. This makes the symbolic life of Çatalhöyük feel less separate from daily living and more woven into it. And because entrances were in the roof, every descent into a house may have had a certain physical drama, even if the inhabitants found it completely normal. You move from light into dimness, from the open roof into enclosed air, from the shared surface of the settlement into a household interior. Your body lowers through the opening, feet finding the ladder, hands gripping wood worn by use. At the bottom, the room opens around you. Platforms, hearth, plastered walls, perhaps horns or painted forms, perhaps bins and tools, perhaps the place where ancestors lie beneath the floor. The architecture makes entry a transition. Not a grand ceremonial transition necessarily, but a felt one. You do not simply step over a threshold. You climb down into a world. That may help explain why the house was so central. In a town without streets, the home becomes the main unit of social space. It is where life is organised and meaning is stored. The roof connects homes, but the interior defines them. The community is not built around a central square. It is built from many household centres pressed together. Each house is a cell, but the town is the body. And like a body, it functions through connections that are not always visible from outside. The outer edge of the settlement may have formed something like a continuous wall, simply because the houses were packed together, though we should be cautious about imagining a fortress. There is debate about defence and access, and the evidence does not need to support a dramatic picture of constant danger. Still, the architecture would have made entry into the settlement more controlled than a loose village with many paths between buildings. If you are an outsider, you cannot simply stroll down Main Street, mostly because Main Street has not been invented here, and would be very surprised to hear itself discussed. You would need to know where to climb, where to cross, whose roof you are on, and how to enter. The settlement may not have had a gate in the later urban sense, but its design created boundaries. For the people who belonged there, however, those boundaries may have felt natural. This is important. What seems strange to us may have been ordinary to them. The first time we hear about roof entrances, it sounds like an architectural riddle. But for someone born at Çatalhöyük, climbing down into a house was simply how houses worked. Streets might have seemed inefficient, messy, and far too inviting to animals, strangers, and mud. Front doors at ground level may have seemed like an odd habit of people who had not yet discovered the convenience of roofs. Every culture makes common sense out of its own arrangements. The difficulty is remembering that our version of common sense is not universal. It is just well rehearsed. The density of Çatalhöyük also suggests a community comfortable with proximity. Living so close to others requires rules, formal or informal. People had to coordinate repairs, respect movement routes, manage smoke, dispose of waste, maintain boundaries, and negotiate access. There may have been customs about which roofs could be crossed, who could enter which houses, when visitors were welcome, how workspaces were shared, and what obligations existed between households. None of this needed writing to function. Human communities are extremely good at building systems of expectation through habit, gossip, approval, disapproval, and the powerful ancient technology known as everyone knowing what you did. In a settlement as dense as Çatalhöyük, reputation may have travelled faster than a child across a roof. The lack of monumental central buildings does not mean lack of organisation. In some ways, it may suggest a different kind of organisation, one based on repeated household practices rather than centralised command. The settlement had to work, roofs had to hold, food had to circulate, materials had to be acquired, buildings had to be maintained, social tensions had to be managed. A dense town cannot last for centuries if everyone is simply improvising every morning. There must have been shared understandings, inherited techniques, and social mechanisms that kept life moving. We may not see an office, a palace, or a council hall, but we see the result of coordination in the architecture itself. The town held together, literally and socially, for a very long time. This is why calling Çatalhöyük a town built like a honeycomb is not only about its shape, it is about how that shape expresses a way of living. The architecture creates closeness without streets, separation without front doors, household identity without isolated houses, and community without obvious public monuments. It forces us to rethink what public and private might mean. The public world may have been overhead, the private world below, the past beneath the platforms, the future built above the walls. A person at Çatalhöyük lived not just beside neighbours, but physically attached to them through mud brick and roof lines. As we keep moving through this strange settlement, the houses become harder to treat as ordinary houses in the modern sense. They were practical homes, yes. People cooked there, slept there, repaired tools, stored food, and complained about smoke, with what we may safely assume was timeless sincerity. But they were also places of memory, ritual, and burial. The same platforms that supported the living could cover the dead. The same plastered floors that were swept and renewed could seal bodies below. The same house that smelled of bread, ash, and clay could also hold generations of ancestors beneath its surface. So once we've climbed down from the roof and allowed our eyes to adjust to the dim interior, the next question is not simply how these people lived inside their homes, but who else, in a quieter and older sense, was living there with them. Once we've climbed down through the roof opening and allowed our eyes to adjust to the dimmer air inside a Çatalhöyük house, the settlement becomes stranger in a quieter way. From above, the town already feels unusual, with its crowded roofs, hidden entrances, and tight mud brick cells pressed together like a human hive. But inside the house, the puzzle changes from architecture to memory. The room is not only a place for cooking, sleeping, grinding grain, repairing tools, telling children where not to put their hands, and trying to persuade smoke to leave through the correct hole. It is also a place where the dead are near, not beyond a wall, not outside the settlement, not in a cemetery at the edge of town where the living visit on appointed days. At Çatalhöyük, many of the dead were placed beneath the floors of houses, often below platforms that the living continued to use. Human remains in both primary and secondary burial contexts are commonly found under floors and platforms, and researchers have emphasized that, in a settlement lacking obvious monumental temples or large public buildings, the house itself became the center of domestic life, ritual activity, burial, and remembrance. That idea can take a moment to settle. The home was not simply beside the tomb. The home was also the tomb. The floor under your feet might cover a body. The platform where someone slept might rest above the bones of a person who had once lived in the same household, or at least had been chosen to belong there after death. The daily and the funerary were not separated in the way most modern people expect. A meal could be prepared in a room where ancestors lay beneath plaster. A child could grow up knowing that the house contained not just stored food, tools, and sleeping places, but also people who had been folded into the building itself. This was not a small or occasional practice. Subfloor burial was a regular part of life at Çatalhöyük, and some buildings contained multiple burials placed again and again in similar locations beneath their floors. It is worth resisting the urge to make this either too spooky or too sentimental. To us, the thought of sleeping above the dead may feel eerie, as if every house was secretly a ghost story waiting for a candle to flicker at the wrong moment. But for the people of Çatalhöyük, this arrangement may have felt normal, meaningful, and orderly. The dead were not necessarily frightening presences. They may have been members of the household transformed into part of its deeper identity. In many societies, ancestors are not gone in the modern sense. They remain involved, remembered, respected, feared, consulted, or simply present in the structure of social life. At Çatalhöyük, that presence was not only spoken or imagined, it was architectural. The dead were built into the home. The bodies were often placed in flexed positions, with knees drawn up, as if the body had been carefully arranged to fit within a small burial cut beneath the floor. Sometimes individuals were buried alone. Sometimes several were placed in the same area over time. Some burials were disturbed later, not necessarily by accident, but as part of continuing practices around the body. In some cases, skulls or other bones were removed, curated or redeposited. This is one of those details that can easily become dramatic if handled carelessly. We should not picture a horror scene. We should picture ritual. Bones could be powerful things, not because people were morbid, but because bodies connected the living to memory, identity, and belonging. A skull was not just a skull. It may have been a person reduced to a symbol, an ancestor made portable, a remembered presence that could be moved, displayed, hidden, returned, or transformed. Archaeologists have found that burials were often associated with particular parts of the house, especially beneath platforms. A platform, then, was not just a convenient raised surface. It could be a sleeping area, a working area, a place of symbolic focus, and a burial place all at once. The same surface could support the living body above and protect the dead body below. That double role makes the interior of a Çatalhöyük house feel layered in more ways than one. There were layers of plaster on the walls, layers of occupation under the house, layers of memory in the building's history, and layers of bodies beneath the floor. The house was a vertical record, not only of construction, but of relationships. This gives the act of replastering a different emotional weight. Floors and walls at Çatalhöyük were often maintained and renewed with layers of plaster. A fresh layer could clean, seal, restore, and mark continuity. After a burial, the floor could be closed again. Life could resume above. The room might look clean and ordinary, but beneath the surface something had changed. A person had been added to the house. The living did not move away from the dead. They covered them, stayed with them, and continued the routines of household life. There is something deeply practical about this, and something deeply meaningful. The dead were not abandoned. They were incorporated, and this is where Çatalhöyük becomes difficult for the usual story of civilization. Later cities often show a separation. Districts, temples, cemeteries, workshops, administrative buildings, palaces, storage areas, streets. Different functions take different spaces. Çatalhöyük folds functions together: cooking and ritual, sleeping and burial, household labour and symbolic display. The home becomes a small universe, containing the needs of daily life and the mysteries of death under one roof, or rather under one roof entrance, since the roof was also the doorway and in some ways the street. This is not simple living. It is dense living, dense with bodies, meanings, tasks and memories. The absence of a separate cemetery is especially striking. Cemeteries are useful to archaeologists because they create a clear category. Here are the living spaces, there are the dead. But Çatalhöyük does not offer that comfort. The dead are inside the settlement, inside houses, beneath floors that were swept, crossed and renewed. This means that to understand burial, we must understand buildings. To understand buildings, we must understand households. And to understand households, we have to accept that a house may not have been merely a private residence in the modern sense. It may have been a social institution, a container for ancestry, ritual, identity and rights. A person may have belonged not only to a family, but to a house with a history. The phrase house society is sometimes used in archaeological discussions to think about places like Çatalhöyük, where the house is not just a shelter, but a long-lived social unit. In such a system, the house can carry identity across generations, almost like a lineage with walls. People may be born into it, marry into it, work for it, inherit from it, remember through it, and be buried within it. The building becomes more than the sum of its bricks. It becomes a social body. This idea is attractive because it helps explain why some Çatalhöyük buildings were rebuilt on the same footprints and why some received more burials or symbolic treatment than others. Not every house had to be equal in memory. Some may have been older, more prestigious, more ritually active, or more central to the identities of the people connected with them. But here, as always with Çatalhöyük, the moment we think we have found a neat answer, the site gently moves the furniture around while we are not looking. Genetic and burial research has complicated the simple assumption that people buried under the same house were always close biological relatives. Studies reported in 2021 found that adults and children buried beneath the floors of Neolithic homes were not necessarily related in the straightforward family household way archaeologists had once expected. That does not make the burials less meaningful. It makes them more interesting. If the dead beneath a house were not always biological kin, then belonging may have been created through other forms of relationship. Social ties, adoption, alliance, ritual membership, residence, labour, ancestry claimed rather than inherited, or categories we do not have names for. In other words, the house may not have been a family home in the narrow modern sense. It may have been something broader, more flexible and harder to translate. This is a useful reminder that kinship is not always biology wearing a polite hat. Human societies create relatedness in many ways. People become kin through birth, marriage, shared food, shared work, ritual, care, memory, obligation, and story. At Çatalhöyük, a person could perhaps be placed beneath a floor not because they shared DNA with the living occupants, but because they belong to the house in another way. Maybe they were raised there. Maybe they were connected through marriage or exchange. Maybe their body carried symbolic value. Maybe certain houses gathered certain kinds of dead for reasons known to the community and now mostly hidden from us. Archaeology can recover bones, positions, dates, and genetic signals. It cannot always recover the sentence someone spoke when the burial pit was sealed. Still, the repetition of burial beneath house floors tells us that this was not random disposal. It was structured. People knew where to place bodies, they reopened spaces, they arranged remains, they returned to the same parts of buildings. They treated the floor as a boundary that could be crossed carefully, then closed. There may have been ceremonies, spoken words, gestures, food, objects, mourners, or quiet practical actions that left almost no trace. The burial itself is what survives. The grief, if there was grief, has to be inferred gently. It is easy to forget that every archaeological burial was once a human event. Someone died. Someone carried the body. Someone prepared a place. Someone covered it. Someone went on living above it. The bodies beneath the houses also force us to think about smell, timing, and practical knowledge. In many cases, bodies were likely buried soon after death in prepared pits. But secondary burial practices suggest that some remains were moved or manipulated after decomposition. This means people understood the stages of the body after death, not in scientific language, but through direct experience. They knew when bones could be handled. They knew how to reopen a burial. They knew how to remove a skull or redeposit remains. Death was not hidden away from daily life by professional services, paperwork and quiet vehicles arriving at the curb. It was handled by the community, close to home, with bodies present and known. For modern listeners, this may sound confronting, but it may also reveal something about how separated many of us have become from death as a physical process. We often encounter death through distance: hospitals, funeral homes, cemeteries, legal documents, carefully managed rituals. At Çatalhöyük, death seems woven into domestic space. This does not mean it was casual. In fact, the care taken with burial suggests the opposite. But it was close. It was not treated as pollution that had to be expelled beyond the edges of the living world. It was placed under the world people continued to inhabit. Some houses contained more burials than others, and that unevenness has led to many interpretations. Were certain houses more important? Did some serve as memory centres for larger groups? Were they associated with particular lineages, rituals, or social roles? Or did the number of burials simply reflect how long a house was occupied and reused? The answer may be partly all of these, with the additional complication that different periods of the settlement may have worked differently. Çatalhöyük lasted too long for one explanation to cover everything neatly. A practice could begin with one meaning, continue with another, and be remembered later simply as tradition. Humans are very good at preserving actions after the original explanation has wandered off somewhere, possibly to sit quietly with the missing socks. The relationship between houses and bodies also changes how we imagine inheritance. In a society where property, identity, or rights might be tied to a house, burial beneath its floors could help anchor claims. The ancestors beneath the platform might say, in effect, "This place has history, and we belong to it." That does not mean people were drawing up legal deeds in mud brick. It means that memory can be a form of authority. If a household could point to generations of buried dead beneath its floors, it may have carried a different weight in the community. A house with many remembered bodies might have been socially powerful, even if it looked much like its neighbours from the outside. This is one reason the lack of palaces at Çatalhöyük should not tempt us into imagining a perfectly flat society where no one had influence, prestige, or special knowledge. Power does not always build towers. Sometimes it hides in relationships, ritual authority, control of memory, access to objects, or the ability to organise people around a house history. The settlement may have been broadly similar in architecture, but similarity is not the same as sameness. Some homes were more elaborately decorated, some had more burials, some had installations involving animal parts, reliefs, or painted surfaces. The differences are subtle compared with later royal cities, but subtle does not mean unimportant. A whisper can carry authority in a quiet room. The emotional atmosphere inside such a house is hard to reconstruct, but we can think carefully about what it might have meant to live above the dead. The buried were not visible most of the time. Once the floor was sealed and replastered, daily life covered them. That hiddenness matters. These were not graves marked with stones and visited from outside. They were concealed beneath the domestic surface. The memory of them had to be carried by people, stories, practices, and perhaps the building itself. A child might be told who lay beneath a platform, or perhaps not told until older. A visitor might know that a certain house contained many ancestors. A person sleeping above a burial may have felt comfort, duty, status, fear, or nothing unusual at all. We should allow for ordinary familiarity. What seems profound from a distance may have been part of the background texture of life. At the same time, the dead could return to visibility if burials were reopened or bones removed. This creates a rhythm between concealment and revelation. A body is placed beneath the floor. The floor is sealed. Time passes. The house is used. Later, someone cuts into the platform again. Bones are encountered. A skull may be removed. New remains may be added. The floor is sealed once more. The house continues. In this rhythm, the dead are not simply deposited and forgotten. They are sometimes revisited physically. The boundary between living space and burial space is stable enough to support daily life, but not so absolute that it can never be crossed. There is a strangely architectural tenderness in that. The house keeps the dead safe, while the dead help make the house meaningful. The living maintain the plaster, repair the walls, and pass over the platforms. The buried remain below, silent but not absent. A household is not just made of the people currently breathing inside it. It is made of those who came before, those remembered, those chosen, and those placed into the floor. The house becomes a vessel of time, though not the kind measured by clocks. It measures time in replastered surfaces, rebuilt walls, sealed pits, and the slow accumulation of bodies beneath places where life keeps happening. This also changes how we think about the end of a house. At Çatalhöyük, buildings were sometimes closed, filled in and built over. If a house contained burials, closing it was not merely demolition. It was the ending of a social space that held the dead. The filling of a house could be a deliberate act, not just a practical one. A room might be packed, its features covered, its opening sealed, its biography completed. Then a new house could rise above it, connected to the old by location, memory or design. This is one of the reasons the mound grew so meaningfully. It was not just garbage and collapsed mud brick, it was closed houses beneath new houses, each one carrying traces of the living and the dead. The connection between burial and household space also helps explain why the interiors of some houses were so carefully decorated. If the home was a place where ancestors rested, where bodies were placed beneath platforms, and where memory was renewed through plaster and ritual, then wall paintings and installations were not merely decoration in the modern sense. They belonged to a world where the house was charged with meaning. The walls, floors, benches, platforms, horns, reliefs and burials all formed part of the same environment. The dead beneath the floor and the images on the wall may have spoken to each other symbolically in ways we can describe but not fully translate. This is why separating art, religion, architecture, and domestic life can be misleading. At Çatalhöyük, those categories may not have been separate at all. There is another quiet puzzle here. If the dead were buried beneath houses, where did grief go? Did it stay inside? Did mourning happen on rooftops, in dim rooms beside platforms around the burial cut? Did the smell of fresh plaster after a burial become associated with loss? Did people avoid certain places for a time or sit close to them? Did some burials bring neighbours together, with people descending through roof openings into a room made temporarily more crowded by the presence of death? We do not know, but asking these questions helps keep the people human. Çatalhöyük can become so famous for its unusual architecture and symbolic mysteries that the individuals beneath the floors become evidence first and people second. Yet each skeleton belonged to a body that once had warmth, hunger, fatigue, habits, and relationships. The archaeology is extraordinary because the lives were ordinary enough to continue, and perhaps that is what makes these house tombs so powerful. They do not separate the extraordinary from the everyday. The mystery is not hidden in a royal crypt beneath a pyramid or in a sealed chamber filled with gold. It is under the platform where someone may have slept. It is beneath the floor near the hearth. It is in the room where grain was ground, meals were shared, and walls were replastered. Çatalhöyük asks us to imagine a world where death was not pushed outside the settlement's boundaries, but domesticated, remembered, and built into the place where life went on. Not in a careless way, not in a gloomy way. In a structured, repeated, meaningful way that lasted across generations. So when we call these houses tombs, we should not imagine that they were only tombs. They were homes first in the sense that people lived there, worked there and maintained them, but they were homes with depth, homes with human histories beneath their surfaces, homes where the floor was not merely a floor, but a sealed horizon between the active life of the room and the remembered life below. Every step across such a room may have crossed a map of unseen relationships. Every platform may have carried more than one kind of body across time. Every layer of plaster may have renewed not just a surface, but a connection. By now, the inside of Çatalhöyük no longer feels like a simple domestic space. It is still practical, still smoky, still filled with the daily demands of food, fire, storage, and sleep. But it is also a place where the dead remain close, and where memory has been pressed into architecture. The house is doing many jobs at once, as houses often do, though this one is doing rather more than holding up a roof and keeping the rain off someone's bread. And as our eyes move upward from the floor, from the buried bodies and sealed platforms, we begin to notice that the walls too are not empty. They have been plastered, painted, shaped, renewed, and sometimes watched over by animals whose meanings are still difficult to grasp. The dead lie below, but the walls seem to look back. From the floors and platforms of Çatalhöyük, where the dead rested beneath the living, the eye naturally moves upward. In these houses, the walls were not empty boundaries. They were worked, renewed, painted, shaped, and sometimes fitted with animal parts in ways that make the rooms feel less like simple shelters and more like carefully maintained worlds of memory. If the floor held the past underfoot, the walls held images directly in front of the living. They were not just keeping out the weather. They were carrying scenes, marks, bodies, horns, patterns, and creatures whose meanings are still not fully understood. And this is where Çatalhöyük becomes especially difficult to place in the usual story of early civilization, because the symbolic life of the settlement does not seem to gather in one grand temple. It appears inside the houses, beside ovens, above platforms, near burials, and among the ordinary materials of daily life. The walls of many houses were covered in white plaster, and on these prepared surfaces people painted hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and other designs. The Çatalhöyük Research Project describes homes with white plastered walls and floors, decorated with elaborate painting showing hunting scenes and geometric patterns, while other evidence points to house platforms with bullhorn installations and handprints on the wall. That detail is worth slowing down for, because plaster is not passive. A plastered wall has to be made, smoothed, dried, sometimes repaired, and then renewed. It is labour, it is maintenance. It is a decision to create a surface clean enough and important enough to receive marks. A mud brick wall could simply be a wall. At Çatalhöyük, many walls became something more like a working skin, refreshed again and again through the life of the house. Some sources note that decoration was found in many excavated houses, often in the main room, and that plastering and repainting could be repeated frequently, perhaps seasonally or even more often in some cases. That means the art was not always meant to last forever in the way a carved stone monument might. It could be renewed, covered, replaced, repainted, and folded into the life cycle of the house. A painting might appear, remain visible for a period, then disappear beneath another layer of plaster. To modernise, that can feel almost wasteful. Why paint something only to cover it? But then again, we repaint rooms, replace wallpaper, rearrange furniture, update photographs, and quietly pretend the old bathroom colour was never our idea. At Çatalhöyük, renewal itself may have been part of the meaning. The wall was not just a display. It was a surface that changed with the household. The images included animals, people, patterns and scenes that seemed to pull the outside world into the enclosed interior. Bulls, deer, vultures, leopards, bears, birds and other wild creatures appear in paintings, reliefs and installations. The official site summary connects ritual life at Çatalhöyük with hunting, death and animals, noting the importance of wild bulls in feasting and possible special meanings attached to animals such as leopards and bears. This is striking because Çatalhöyük was a settled community of farmers and herders, yet its symbolic walls often look toward wildness. The animals that stare out from the plaster are not simply sheep in a pen or cattle waiting calmly beside a fence. They are powerful animals, dangerous animals, animals of the hunt, animals with horns, claws, wings, teeth, beaks and force. In a house where grain was stored and meals were cooked, the walls remembered a world beyond the roofscape. The most famous of these animal features are the bull installations, often called bucrania, meaning the skull or head of a bull or ox used as a decorative or ritual element. In many Çatalhöyük houses, plastered bull skulls were set into walls or platforms with horns projecting into the room, and some were painted with red ochre. This is not decoration in the mild sense of a nice picture over the sofa. Imagine sitting in a dim room, the light dropping from a roof opening, the hearth smoking gently or perhaps not so gently, and from the wall or platform a pair of horns pushes outward into the space. The animal is not fully there, but it is not absent either. Its head has been reshaped, plastered, coloured, and fixed into the architecture. The wall watches with a force borrowed from the animal body. There is something practical and unsettling about using real animal remains in this way. Horns are not painted symbols only. They are material things taken from creatures that once moved, breathed, struggled, and perhaps were hunted or consumed in a feast. By setting them into the house, people brought a piece of that animal force indoors. The wild bull, or aurochs, was a massive and dangerous animal. To hunt one would have required courage, cooperation, skill, and possibly a willingness to have a very serious conversation with one's own mortality. So when bullhorns appear inside houses, they may point toward memory of dangerous encounters, feasting events, group identity, or stories about strength and control. We should be cautious, because the exact meaning is not written on the wall. But the choice of animal was surely not random. No one accidentally installs a bull's horns in a plastered room and then says, well, that seems cosy enough. Other animal parts were also included in walls and platforms. Skulls, teeth, tusks, beaks, and horns could be plastered and painted, turning fragments of once living creatures into features of the built environment. This gives the interior of the house a strange mixture of domestic order and wild presence. People were living inside carefully maintained rooms, but those rooms contained pieces of animals from beyond the settlement. It is as though the house was not trying to exclude the outside world completely. It was selecting parts of it, shaping them, fixing them into plaster, and making them part of the household memory. The wall became a place where the border between human space and animal power could be negotiated. The painted scenes are just as intriguing. Some show animals alone, others show animals interacting with people. Smart history describes figural paintings that include scenes such as vultures near human corpses and hunting scenes, while wall reliefs often represent animals or human-like forms. These are not casual little sketches made absent-mindedly while waiting for dinner. They belong to a wider symbolic system that returned again and again to certain themes: wild animals, human bodies, hunting, death, and transformation. The exact stories behind them are gone, but the repetition suggests that people at Çatalhöyük were not decorating randomly. They were using a shared visual language, even if we can now only understand parts of its grammar. The vulture scenes are among the most discussed because they seem to connect directly with death. Images of large birds near human bodies have often been interpreted in relation to excarnation, the exposure of bodies so that birds or natural processes remove flesh before bones are collected or buried. We should be careful here, because interpretation is difficult. A painted vulture near a human body does not automatically prove a complete funerary practice. But when we remember that skulls and bones at Çatalhöyük were sometimes manipulated, removed, and redeposited, the connection between birds, bodies, and the treatment of the dead becomes difficult to ignore. The wall imagery and the burial practices seem to speak from the same general world. Even if we cannot translate the whole conversation, the animal reliefs add another layer. Some show paired creatures facing one another. Some human-like figures have been interpreted in different ways over time, including as bears, goddesses, or humans, and in some cases their heads, hands, and feet seem to have been removed when a house was abandoned. That last detail is especially interesting because it suggests that these images had life histories. They were not simply made and forgotten. They could be altered, damaged, covered, or deliberately ended. A relief might belong to a house during its active life, and then, when the house was closed, its body might be changed too. In this sense, images at Çatalhöyük were not static art objects. They were participants in household time. We are used to thinking of art as something preserved, protected, and admired. In museums, a painted surface is kept behind glass, carefully lit and guarded from humidity, fingerprints, and overly enthusiastic school groups. At Çatalhöyük, the paintings and reliefs lived inside smoky rooms. They were near hearths, bodies, food, tools, plaster dust, children, and roof ladders. They may have been touched, seen in flickering light, covered by smoke stains, repaired, or plastered over. Their meanings probably depended on when they were seen, by whom, and in what context. A painted bull during an ordinary morning might feel different from the same bull during a feast, a burial, or the closing of a house. Context is everything, and unfortunately context is exactly the sort of thing time likes to misplace. One of the most famous images from Çatalhöyük is often described as a possible map or landscape, with a pattern below that may represent the settlement and a twin-peaked form above that some have interpreted as an erupting volcano, usually linked to Hasan Dağ, about 130 kilometers away. A 2014 PLOS ONE study notes that the mural, dating to around 6600 BCE, has been interpreted as the oldest known map and as a possible depiction of an eruption of Hasan Dağ, while also emphasizing that the interpretation has remained controversial and that alternatives include a leopard skin above geometric motifs. This is a perfect example of Çatalhöyük refusing to sit quietly inside one explanation. If it is a map, it is extraordinary. If it is a volcanic eruption, it may be one of the earliest visual records of a natural event. If it is a leopard skin and pattern, then it belongs instead to the animal symbolism already so strong at the site. Any of these possibilities is interesting. The problem is not that the image lacks meaning. The problem is that it may have meant something very specific to people whose visual world we only partly understand. The same PLOS ONE study reported geological evidence for a Holocene explosive eruption at Hasan Dağ, whose age overlaps with the occupation levels associated with the mural, which supports the possibility that people in the region could have witnessed such an eruption. But even that does not close the case. Geological possibility and artistic interpretation are not the same thing. A volcano may have erupted. People may have seen it. The mural may still not be a volcano, or it may be a volcano seen through a symbolic system that does not match modern landscape painting. This is the delicate part. We cannot simply say, "Ah yes, ancient photograph of an eruption." Neolithic artists were not trying to satisfy a modern geography textbook. They were making images that belonged to their own categories, their own memories, and their own house walls. The possible map is often popular because it makes Çatalhöyük feel startlingly modern. A town plan, a landscape, a volcano. It is tempting to look at it and say, there, they saw the world almost as we do. But the more interesting possibility is that they did not. Their images may not separate map, animal skin, memory, warning, pattern, and ritual the way we do. A modern viewer wants a label. This is a map, this is a painting, this is a shrine, this is decoration. Çatalhöyük keeps mixing the labels together. A wall can be domestic and symbolic. An animal can be food, danger, ancestor, memory, or ritual presence. A pattern can be decoration and meaning at the same time. A house can be a home and a tomb. It is not that the people of Çatalhöyük were confused. It is that our categories may be too narrow. The handprints are another quiet feature worth noticing. A handprint is simple, but deeply human. It is not an animal, not a scene, not a complex pattern. It is the trace of a body against a surface. Someone placed a hand on the wall or around the hand, leaving behind a mark shaped by fingers and palm. Across the world, handprints in ancient art often feel immediately personal because they collapse time so effectively. A bull installation may be powerful but unfamiliar. A vulture scene may be symbolic and difficult. A handprint simply says, "Someone was here," with a hand not so different from yours. Of course, even that feeling can mislead us. The handprint may have had ritual meaning, social meaning, household meaning, or a purpose we do not know. But it remains one of the easiest details to connect with physically. We know what it is to place a hand against a wall. Geometric patterns also deserve attention, even if they do not make for dramatic storytelling in the same way as bulls and vultures. Lines, grids, repeated shapes, and red painted designs may have carried meanings that are now completely opaque. Modern people often underestimate geometric art because it does not show recognizable figures, but pattern can be powerful. It can mark order, identity, rhythm, memory, or belonging. It can refer to textiles, baskets, skins, landscapes, architecture, or ideas that do not need animals or human bodies to be meaningful. A geometric wall at Çatalhöyük may have been just as significant to its makers as a hunting scene. It is only our modern appetite for recognizable pictures that tends to push pattern into the background. The colours were often limited but effective. Red, black and white appear again and again in discussions of Neolithic imagery, and red ochre especially had a long life in prehistoric symbolic practices. At Çatalhöyük, red-painted bull horns, red figures and red designs would have stood out sharply against pale plaster. In a dim room, colour mattered. A red mark on a white wall could catch the eye even in low light. A dark animal figure could seem to emerge from the plaster as the fire shifted. The walls were not bright screens. They were surfaces seen through smoke, daylight from above and flame. That visual environment may have made images feel less fixed than they do in photographs. A painted animal might appear stronger at one time of day than another. A relief might cast shadows that changed with the light. The animals themselves were not all equal in the human imagination. Bulls suggest strength, danger, feasting, and perhaps masculinity or group action, though we should be careful not to force modern associations onto them. Leopards suggest stealth, beauty, danger, and wildness. Vultures suggest death, sky, transformation, and the removal of flesh. Bears suggest power and threat. Deer and other hunted animals may bring in movement, pursuit, and seasonal life. Birds may connect earth and sky, or simply belong to the wetland world around the settlement. These are cautious possibilities, not translations. Archaeologists can identify species in some cases and describe contexts, but meaning depends on cultural stories we no longer have. What stands out is how often wild animals dominate the symbolic field, even as people were living settled agricultural lives. That contrast may be one of the keys to the site. Çatalhöyük was not a community that had simply left the wild behind. It was a community negotiating a new relationship with it. People farmed, stored, built, and buried beneath floors, but the walls still filled with animals that could not be domesticated in any simple sense. Wild bulls were not household pets. Leopards were not polite neighbours. Vultures were not livestock. The house gathered the dangerous outside world and placed it under human control, but only partly. Horns still pointed outward. Animals still watched. Their presence inside the home may have reminded people that settled life did not erase wildness. It brought it into a new kind of conversation. This makes the houses feel like controlled spaces full of uncontrolled memories. The inhabitants lived in carefully plastered rooms, but those rooms displayed animals that resisted domestic order. Perhaps this tension mattered. Early farming life required new discipline. Storage, property, repeated labour, attachment to place, care of crops, management of animals, maintenance of buildings. The old world of hunting and wild movement did not simply disappear. It may have remained important in ritual, identity, feasting, and memory. The art at Çatalhöyük could be one way the community kept that older relationship alive inside a new form of settlement. The placement of imagery within houses also raises questions about who saw it. Were all images visible to everyone who entered? Were some houses open to wider groups for special events? Did certain walls matter more because of where people sat or slept? Were children taught the meanings of specific animals? Did some paintings appear only briefly for rituals before being covered? The evidence gives us the physical remains, but not the social choreography. Still, the fact that symbolism is concentrated inside houses suggests that household interiors were not private in the narrow modern sense. They may have hosted gatherings, feasts, ceremonies, burials, and acts of remembrance. The house could be domestic one day, ritual the next, and probably both at the same time more often than we would expect. There is no need to imagine priests in feathered cloaks solemnly explaining every wall feature, although it would certainly make the museum reconstruction livelier. The rituals of Çatalhöyük may have been embedded in everyday household practice, replastering a wall, placing horns, burying a body, painting a pattern, preparing a feast, closing a house, removing part of a relief. Each action could carry meaning without being separated from ordinary life. This is one of the hardest things for us to grasp because modern societies often divide sacred and practical spaces so clearly. At Çatalhöyük, the sacred may have smelled like smoke and cooked grain. The walls also remind us that these people had time, skill, and shared conventions. Painting and relief work require materials, preparation, knowledge, and intention. Someone had to know how to mix plaster, prepare pigment, apply designs, shape reliefs, and set animal remains into walls securely enough that they lasted. These practices were probably learned across generations. A young person might watch an older person plaster a wall, grind pigment, or press material into shape. Skills move through hands, not manuals, and because many images were renewed or covered, artistic labour may have been continuous, not rare. The house was not decorated once and then left alone. It was maintained as a symbolic environment. This has a gentle but important consequence for how we imagine the people of Çatalhöyük. They were not only farmers, builders and herders, they were also image makers. Their world included design, visual memory, bodily remains, animal power, and surfaces that could be transformed. Even without writing, they made meaning visible. We should not treat writing as the beginning of complex thought. Çatalhöyük had no known script, but its walls are filled with decisions. The problem is that we are reading a language without a dictionary, and every so often the language uses a bull skull as punctuation. The painted walls and watching animals do not give us one clear answer to what Çatalhöyük believed. They give us a pattern of concerns. Animals mattered, death mattered, houses mattered, repetition mattered, wildness mattered, surfaces mattered, memory mattered. Some images were visible, some were covered, some were altered when buildings were abandoned. The walls were active parts of the house's life. They changed, witnessed, and held meanings that passed through generations, even as the settlement itself rose layer by layer into a mound. And maybe this is the best way to sit with the animal walls for now, not as puzzles we must solve too quickly, and not as decorations we can admire from a safe distance, but as evidence of a community thinking through its world with plaster, pigment, bone, horn, and memory. These people lived in a town without streets, entered houses from above, buried the dead beneath floors, and filled their rooms with images of animals that were powerful, dangerous, and difficult to control. The result is not a simple picture of peaceful village life. It is a dense human world, organised without obvious kings, rich without obvious palaces, and symbolic without a separate temple shouting for attention from the centre of town. And that naturally brings us to another part of the mystery, because if Çatalhöyük could build, remember, bury, feast, paint, and organise all of this without leaving behind the usual signs of rulers, then we have to ask how its people managed to live together for so long without the kind of authority we normally expect to find at the heart of a large settlement. If we look for kings at Çatalhöyük, we find ourselves in a rather odd position. We know the settlement was large. We know it lasted for many centuries. We know its people built closely packed houses, maintained plastered interiors, buried the dead beneath floors, created wall paintings, installed animal horns, managed food, made tools, traded for materials, and somehow kept this dense rooftop world functioning long enough for it to rise into a mound. By the usual logic of ancient civilization, someone should be in charge. Somewhere in all that mud brick we expect to find the big house, the chief's residence, the temple office, the storage building with controlled grain, the plaza where orders were given, or at least some slightly larger room where important people sat looking serious while everyone else pretended to agree. But Çatalhöyük does not offer us that scene. It gives us no obvious palace, no royal tomb, no throne room, no king's name carved proudly into stone, no statue with 1 foot forward and an expression that says, "I own this irrigation system." Instead, it gives us houses, more houses, houses beside houses, houses above older houses, houses full of burials, plaster, platforms, ovens, storage bins, paintings, animal installations, and traces of daily work. If there was power here, it did not announce itself with a crown. That absence is one of the reasons Çatalhöyük feels so unsettling to our expectations. Many later civilizations leave behind monuments to authority. Egypt gives us pyramids, temples, and names of rulers carved into stone. Mesopotamia gives us city walls, ziggurats, seals, administrative tablets, and kings, who were very keen to remind everyone that they had built things. The Bronze Age and Iron Age worlds are full of elite burials, fortifications, palatial complexes, specialized workshops, and carefully managed storage systems. Even when we do not understand every detail, we can often point to certain buildings and say, here is power, here is hierarchy, here is central control. At Çatalhöyük, the evidence is much quieter. The settlement was not simple, but its complexity seems to have been organised through households rather than rulers. It is as if the entire place quietly refuses to perform civilization in the expected costume. That does not mean Çatalhöyük was a peaceful utopia where everyone shared equally, never argued, never competed, and always returned borrowed baskets on time. We should be careful with that kind of dream. Human beings do not require kings in order to be complicated. A society can lack palaces and still have status, influence, jealousy, rivalry, obligation, exclusion, leadership, and all the small negotiations that make living with other people both possible and occasionally exhausting. A settlement of several thousand people, packed tightly together for generations, would have needed rules. Not necessarily written laws, not necessarily royal commands, but shared understandings about movement, food, construction, ritual, burial, marriage, work, and access. You cannot maintain a town of roof-entered houses by everyone simply doing whatever seems cheerful at the moment. Roofs have to support weight, walls have to align, fires have to be managed, waste has to be placed somewhere, food has to be stored, children have to be taught where it's safe to climb, and neighbours have to be dealt with carefully, because when your walls touch their walls, a small disagreement can become very architectural. The question then is not whether Çatalhöyük had organisation. It clearly did. The question is, what kind? One possibility is that social order was built through households. Each house may have acted as a social unit, not only where a small family slept, but where memory, ancestry, work, food, and ritual were anchored. Some houses seem to have had longer histories or more elaborate symbolic lives than others. Some contained many burials. Some had special installations, paintings, or repeated rebuilding. These differences may have mattered. A house could have prestige without looking like a palace. A group connected to a particular house might have influence because of its ancestors, its ritual knowledge, its access to resources, or its role in feasts and ceremonies. Power in that case would not stand above the settlement in one central building. It would be distributed through remembered houses, social relationships, and repeated practices. This kind of power is harder for archaeology to see, because it does not always leave a single grand ruin. It lives in patterns. Which houses receive burials? Which houses are rebuilt carefully in place? Which houses have more elaborate wall features? Which objects are found where? Which people are buried with what? What differences appear in diet, labour, health, or access to materials? These are slower clues, less dramatic than a palace doorway, but sometimes more revealing. A king can be easy to identify if he has the courtesy to build a large stone monument to himself. A network of household influence is less helpful. It leaves archaeologists to follow traces through plaster layers, bone chemistry, tool distribution, and the stubborn little facts that do not arrange themselves neatly just because we are tired. The houses at Çatalhöyük, as we have seen, were broadly similar in form. This does not mean identical, but the settlement lacks the obvious architectural gap between rich and poor households that appears in many later urban societies. There is no clear mansion district separated from modest homes, no grand avenue leading to a palace, no enormous temple dominating a central square. The basic unit repeats: a house with platforms, hearth, oven, storage, plastered surfaces, and often burials beneath floors. That repetition suggests a community where social difference may have been restrained, hidden, expressed in subtle ways, or organised around principles very unlike later class systems. It is possible that people valued a kind of visible similarity, even if everyone knew perfectly well which houses had deeper histories or greater ritual importance. Societies can appear outwardly equal while carrying complex internal rankings. Anyone who has ever sat through a family dinner knows this. Another important clue lies in the treatment of men and women. For a long time, Çatalhöyük was sometimes imagined as a place centred on goddess worship or matriarchal religion, partly because of female figurines found at the site, and partly because modern imaginations are very good at taking a small clay object and building an entire social system around it before lunch. But the evidence from burials, diet, and daily life does not support a simple picture of male dominance or female dominance. Instead, many researchers have argued that men and women at Çatalhöyük appear to have had broadly similar access to food and similar burial treatment, although their daily tasks may not have been identical. This is fascinating because it suggests that gender difference existed, as it does in most human societies, but may not have been organised into the kind of sharp inequality seen elsewhere. Again, we must be cautious. Equal treatment in the archaeological record does not mean everyone's life was the same. It does suggest that status was not expressed through obvious gendered wealth in burial or architecture, in the way we might expect if powerful male chiefs or warrior elites dominated the settlement. The same caution applies to leadership. A society can live without kings and still have leaders. There may have been elders, skilled ritual specialists, experienced builders, successful hunters, respected midwives, expert craft workers, people known for settling disputes, people with knowledge of when to plant or where to find particular materials, and people whose opinions carried weight because everyone had learned over time that ignoring them made life more difficult. Leadership does not always require permanent office. It can be situational. The best person to organise a hunt may not be the same person who oversees a burial, negotiates a marriage, repairs a roof, or remembers which house has a claim to a certain platform because someone's great-grandmother was buried there. Çatalhöyük may have functioned through many overlapping forms of authority, none of which needed to become kingship. This is difficult for us because later history often teaches us to see civilization through centralization. We look for the moment when a leader appears, administration forms, surplus is controlled, specialists emerge, and society becomes stratified. That sequence is real in many places, but it is not the only possible route to complexity. Çatalhöyük seems to show that a large, dense, long-lived settlement could exist through a different social arrangement. It was not a state, it was not a city-state, it was not a kingdom. Yet it was not a random village either. It was something more flexible and more unfamiliar, a community large enough to require coordination but organised without the obvious machinery of centralised rule. Food may have been one of the keys. The people of Çatalhöyük farmed cereals and pulses, herded animals, gathered wild plants, and hunted wild animals. Food production creates new forms of dependence and cooperation. Fields need labour, harvests need storage, herds need management. Grain needs grinding, which is one of those tasks that sounds simple until you imagine doing it every day with stone tools and no podcast to help pass the time. The settlement's food system would have required planning and shared knowledge, but it may not have required a central authority collecting and redistributing everything. Households could have managed much of their own production and storage, while also participating in broader social networks of exchange, feasting, assistance, and obligation. In this kind of system, wealth may not accumulate as easily into royal power, especially if social customs encourage sharing, or if prestige comes from giving rather than hoarding. Feasting is especially interesting because it may have helped bind the community together. The presence of wild cattle and other animals in symbolic contexts suggests that large hunting or consumption events may have carried social meaning. A successful hunt of a wild bull would not merely provide meat. It would create a story, a gathering, a display of skill and courage, and perhaps an opportunity for certain households or groups to gain prestige. But prestige earned through feasting can be unstable. It must be renewed. You cannot simply declare yourself king because you hosted one excellent dinner, though many people in history have probably tried something similar. If influence at Çatalhöyük was tied to events, generosity, ritual acts, and household memory, it may have remained distributed rather than hardening into formal monarchy. Craft production offers another angle. People at Çatalhöyük made tools, baskets, textiles, beads, pottery in later phases, and many other objects from materials both local and distant. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for sharp tools, was particularly important in Anatolia and moved through regional exchange networks. Access to such materials might have created status differences, but again we do not see a single controlling elite monopolizing everything in the way later states might. Craft knowledge may have been held within households or shared through networks of apprenticeship. A skilled maker could be valued without becoming a ruler. In many small-scale societies, expertise grants influence, but not necessarily command. The person who knows how to make a fine blade, weave a strong basket, or repair a wall that keeps collapsing may receive respect, favours, or obligations. But that is not the same as having a palace and a tax policy. The roofscape itself may have helped shape a more distributed society. In a town with central streets and plazas, public life can gather in visible places, and authority can perform itself before crowds. At Çatalhöyük, public movement was spread across roofs and domestic interiors. There may have been open spaces or midden areas, and people surely gathered in different ways, but the settlement does not seem built around a single central public stage. If power performs where people gather, then a roof-based settlement may make power more local, more household-centred, more dispersed. There is no obvious balcony from which a ruler could address the town, unless one counts shouting from a roof, which is less dignified and risks being interrupted by someone drying reeds nearby. This does not make Çatalhöyük egalitarian in a simple, comforting way. It makes it socially subtle. Some people probably had more influence than others. Some houses may have been more important. Some groups may have had better access to exchange goods, ritual roles, or remembered ancestors. Children may have inherited social positions through the houses they belonged to, even if those houses were not biologically defined families in the modern sense. Outsiders may have been treated differently from insiders. Certain bodies may have mattered more after death. Certain images may have been made only by certain people. Social life is rarely flat. But the striking thing is that inequality, if present, did not yet translate into the visible apparatus of kingship. One reason this matters is that it challenges a very old assumption about human nature. We often hear that once people live in large groups, hierarchy becomes inevitable. Someone must command, someone must enforce order, someone must own the grain, organise the work, settle disputes, punish troublemakers, and tell everyone where to stand. Çatalhöyük does not prove that hierarchy is avoidable in every large settlement, but it does show that human communities experimented with many forms of organisation before states became dominant. People can coordinate through custom, kinship, household identity, ritual, reputation, seasonal rhythms, shared work, and mutual dependence. These systems are not always gentle. They can be demanding, conservative, and full of pressure. But they are not kingship. Imagine a dispute in Çatalhöyük. Perhaps one household claims another crossed a roof area at the wrong time, damaged plaster, took stored material, mishandled a burial, or failed to contribute to some shared task. There is no evidence of a royal court where the matter would be judged by a seated monarch wearing an impressive hat. Instead, the dispute might be handled through household elders, kin networks, public discussion, ritual compensation, gossip, avoidance, alliance, or collective pressure. In a dense settlement, reputation is a powerful tool. If everyone knows you've behaved badly, your life becomes harder very quickly. People may refuse help, withhold exchange, mock you on rooftops, or tell the story so often that your grandchildren are still hearing about it. Written law is not the only way to regulate behaviour. Sometimes the ancient court system is simply a neighbour with a long memory. Violence is another question. A town without kings is not necessarily a town without conflict. Archaeologists have found evidence of interpersonal violence in many ancient communities, including healed cranial injuries in some Çatalhöyük individuals. Dense living can produce tension. Crowding, smoke, labour, food stress, illness, and social competition all create pressure. If people were living wall to wall for generations, disagreements were inevitable. The important point is that the settlement endured despite these pressures. Whatever conflicts existed, they did not prevent the community from maintaining its way of life for centuries. That endurance suggests effective social mechanisms, even if they were not centralised. Health also complicates the picture. Life at Çatalhöyük was not soft. Dense settlement can bring disease. Indoor hearths bring smoke exposure. Grinding grain wears joints. Farming changes diets. Close living with animals and waste creates risks. The shift towards settled life often carried costs along with benefits. So when we imagine people living without kings, we should not imagine a gentle garden of perfect harmony. It was a hard-working, physically demanding, smoky, crowded, deeply social world. Yet its people found ways to make it last. That may be more impressive than a fantasy of peace. They were not free because life was easy. They were organised without obvious rulers while life remained very real, with all the aches, illnesses, obligations, and small domestic frustrations that come with being human. The absence of writing also means that authority did not operate through written administration, at least not in any form we can recognise. Later states often depend on records, accounts, taxes, property lists, labour obligations, decrees. Çatalhöyük had no tablets telling us who owed grain to whom. That does not mean people lacked memory or accounting. They may have used tokens, marks, oral agreements, repeated practices, or household storage to manage obligations. But without writing, social order depended heavily on memory and embodied knowledge. People remembered who belonged where, who had given what, who had married whom, who had hosted a feast, who had been buried beneath which platform, who could be trusted, and who definitely could not be trusted with a borrowed tool. Memory was not decorative, it was infrastructure. This brings us back to the houses. A house filled with burials and symbolic features could act almost like a document, not written in words, but in architecture. Its history was visible or known through its layout, its paintings, its platforms, its deposits, and the stories attached to it. The house recorded relationships in a way that people could experience physically. You could stand in it, sleep in it, work in it, bury someone in it, close it, and rebuild above it. In a society without kings and without writing, Houses may have carried the authority that later societies placed in monuments and records. They made memory durable, and this may explain why Çatalhöyük's social world feels both familiar and alien. Familiar, because we all know that homes can carry identity. Even today, houses are not just shelters. They hold family stories, inherited objects, old arguments, repairs no one wants to discuss, and the mysterious drawer that contains batteries, string, expired coupons, and one key no one recognizes. Alien, because at Çatalhöyük the house seems to have carried social and ritual weight far beyond most modern homes. It was a place of ancestors, art, food, labour, memory, and perhaps authority. The settlement did not need a king's palace if every significant house was, in its own way, a small institution. Of course, this still leaves open the question of collective decision-making. How are large-scale matters handled? If many houses needed to coordinate rebuilding, settlement boundaries, shared resources, or seasonal movements, some kind of group decision process must have existed. Perhaps elders from important houses met informally. Perhaps ritual events brought people together and created opportunities to settle matters. Perhaps decisions emerged gradually through custom rather than meetings. Perhaps influential people guided choices without holding permanent office. We do not know. But the lack of central building suggests that decision-making was not concentrated in a single architectural centre. It may have been woven through the community, happening in houses, on roofs, during feasts, at burials, in work groups, and in repeated conversations over time. There is a lesson here, though it is not a simple one. Çatalhöyük does not tell us that hierarchy is unnatural, nor that ancient people once lived in perfect equality before civilization spoiled everything. That would be too easy, and probably untrue. What it does tell us is that early settled life was more experimental than the old diagrams suggest. Human communities tried different ways of living together. Some became hierarchical and state-like. Some remained small and mobile. Some formed dense settlements without obvious kings. Çatalhöyük belongs to that wider field of possibility. It is a reminder that civilization, if we use that word at all, did not have one starting shape. The people who lived there may not have thought of themselves as unusual. They were not making a statement against monarchy. They were simply living according to systems that made sense in their world. They built houses close together because that was how their settlement worked. They entered from roofs because that was how houses were entered. They buried the dead beneath floors because that was how people belonged. They painted walls, installed horns, cooked, repaired, argued, taught, mourned, remembered, and rebuilt. The absence of kings is startling to us because we are looking backward through thousands of years of states and empires. To them, a king might have seemed unnecessary, inconvenient, or completely unimaginable. Why would one person need a palace when the important work of life was already held by the houses, the ancestors, the rituals, and the people who knew how things were done? As the settlement grew and endured, it may have balanced sameness and difference with great care. Houses looked similar enough to maintain social cohesion, but some carried more symbolic weight. People may have shared broad access to food and space, while still competing through feasts, memory, or ritual distinction. Leadership may have existed without becoming monarchy. Influence may have circulated rather than accumulating permanently. This is a delicate system, and perhaps not an endlessly stable one. Over time, Çatalhöyük changed. Practices shifted. The Eastbound was eventually abandoned while later occupation continued elsewhere. No social arrangement lasts forever, especially one built from mud brick memory and human patience. Still, for many centuries the people of Çatalhöyük lived in a large community without leaving behind the marks of kingship. That fact alone is remarkable. It suggests a society where the centre was not a ruler, but the house, not a palace, but a network of households, not a royal tomb, but many burials beneath many floors. Their world was organised, but not in the manner of later states. It was symbolic, but not focused in a single public temple. It was dense, but not street-based. It was settled, but still filled with wild animals on the walls. It was communal, but not necessarily simple. And it was ancient, yet in some ways it feels startlingly relevant, because it reminds us that human beings have always been inventing ways to live together, and not all of those ways lead immediately to crowns, taxes, and someone insisting that their name be carved larger than everyone else's. And just when we begin to feel that we have a reasonable picture of this society without kings, another older interpretation rises from the excavation dust and asks to be reconsidered. Because for decades, Çatalhöyük has been associated in the popular imagination with powerful female figures, seated bodies, fertile forms, and the idea of a great mother goddess watching over the settlement. It is an appealing image, and like many appealing images, it has caused a great deal of trouble. It is difficult to talk about Çatalhöyük for very long without eventually meeting the woman on the chair. She is one of the most famous objects ever found at the site, a small baked clay figurine usually known as the seated woman of Çatalhöyük. She sits upright, heavy-bodied, calm and powerful, with her hands resting on the heads of two animals often described as leopards or large felines. Her body is full, her posture steady, and for many people she seems, at first glance, to announce exactly what she is: a goddess, a mother, a queen of fertility, a great female power from the deep Neolithic past. It is an image that feels almost too perfect for the imagination. Here, in this strange settlement without kings, without streets, without obvious temples, perhaps there was another kind of sacred authority at the centre of things. Perhaps Çatalhöyük was not ruled by chiefs or kings, but watched over by a mother goddess, seated among animals, giving life to the fields, the houses, the dead beneath the floors, and the people who moved across the roofs above them. It is a compelling idea. It is also one that archaeologists have been arguing with, revising, defending, doubting, and carefully taking apart for decades, which is very inconsiderate of the past, really. Just when we think it has handed us a nice simple symbol, it turns out to be a small clay object with a complicated excavation history, uncertain meaning, and a large crowd of modern interpretations standing around it with notebooks. The mother goddess interpretation began largely with James Mellart, the archaeologist whose excavations in the 1960s first made Çatalhöyük internationally famous. Mellart uncovered remarkable houses, wall paintings, reliefs, burials, animal installations, and many figurines. Among these, female figures received enormous attention. In a time when archaeology, popular culture, and wider spiritual movements were all becoming increasingly interested in ancient goddess traditions, Çatalhöyük seemed to offer something extraordinary. A large Neolithic settlement whose symbolic world might have revolved around female fertility and divine motherhood. Mellart interpreted some of the figurines and reliefs as evidence of goddess worship, perhaps even a dominant mother goddess cult. The seated figure became the star witness. She looked powerful, she looked female, she looked fertile. And because she was found in a settlement already rich with mystery, the story grew quickly. It is not hard to understand why. The figurine is visually striking. Her body does not match later classical ideals of slimness or youth. She appears mature, abundant, physically present. To many modern viewers, that looks like fertility made solid. The animals beside her seem to intensify the impression of power. A seated figure flanked by felines can easily remind us of later goddesses and divine women from many cultures, even if those later comparisons are separated by thousands of years and many dangerous assumptions. The human mind loves patterns. Show us a seated woman with animals, and we begin connecting dots across millennia with the confidence of someone who has not yet been stopped by a specialist. But the first caution is simple. Looking like a goddess to us does not mean being a goddess to them. Ancient objects do not carry labels explaining their meanings, and even when they do, as in later literate societies, people still manage to argue about them. At Çatalhöyük, there is no written text saying, This is the Great Mother. Please place offerings here before lunch. There is no temple inscription, no myth, no prayer, no divine name preserved on clay. What we have are objects, contexts, bodies, buildings, and patterns. We have to interpret them, and interpretation is not the same as certainty. The figurines from Çatalhöyük are numerous, but they are not all female, and they are not all carefully made sacred icons. Many are small, simple, and roughly shaped. Some are animals, some are human-like but ambiguous. Some seem unfinished. Some may have been made quickly from clay and discarded. Many were found not in special shrines, but in everyday or refuse contexts, mixed with the debris of ordinary life. This does not mean they had no meaning. Objects found in rubbish can still be meaningful, because people often dispose of meaningful things in structured ways. But it does complicate the idea that every figurine was a revered goddess idol. If a modern archaeologist dug up a house and found dozens of small objects, some carefully made, some crude, some broken, some in trash, some in storage, it would be risky to call all of them gods. Some might be toys, teaching objects, charms, ritual items, tokens, household symbols, practice pieces, or things whose categories do not match ours at all. This is where the goddess question becomes less about one answer and more about how we approach the past. Earlier interpretations often leaned heavily on the idea of fertility. Female body, therefore mother. Full body, therefore fertility. Fertility, therefore goddess. It is a smooth chain, but smooth chains can slide too quickly. A figurine with breasts or belly may relate to fertility, but it may also represent age, ancestry, status, transformation, bodily power, pregnancy, nourishment, death, or simply a human body. A mature female figure might be a mother, but she might also be an elder. She might be a person of authority. She might represent a category of being that is not exactly human and not exactly divine. She might not be female in the way we are assuming. Some figurines have ambiguous sex characteristics, and some bodies may have been altered or intentionally left unclear. The past does not always arrange its gender symbols for modern convenience. The famous seated figure itself has been reinterpreted many times. Instead of a young, fertile mother, some scholars have suggested that she may represent an older woman, perhaps an elder or ancestor. Her body could signify maturity rather than fertility. Her seated posture could signal authority, not motherhood. The animals beside her might not be leopards in a simple goddess and feline scene. They might be supports, companions, symbols, or even part of a more complex image of transformation. Some have pointed out that what look like felines might be difficult to identify with certainty. Others have asked whether the figure's pose represents giving birth, sitting in power, or something else entirely. Each interpretation opens a different door, and none of them lets us walk confidently into a final answer. Then there is the problem of scale. If Çatalhöyük truly centred on a great mother goddess cult, we might expect the evidence to be more consistent and more dominant across the settlement. We might expect repeated, clearly sacred spaces built around female imagery. We might expect figurines placed in special settings again and again. We might expect female forms to dominate wall paintings and installations as strongly as wild animals do. But the symbolic world of Çatalhöyük is full of bulls, vultures, wild creatures, horn installations, hunting scenes, geometric patterns, burials, skull practices, plastered reliefs, and many other elements. Female figurines are part of that world, but they are not the whole of it. In fact, when later excavations took a more systematic approach, the idea of an all-dominating goddess became harder to maintain. The evidence looked more varied, more domestic, more distributed, and less like a single organised religion centred on one divine mother. That does not mean the feminine was unimportant. It means we have to be careful not to let one powerful image swallow the entire site. Çatalhöyük was already unusual because it lacked obvious kings, The temptation then was to replace missing kings with a goddess. If there is no male ruler, perhaps there is a female deity. If there is no palace, perhaps every house is a shrine to the mother. It is a neat reversal, and reversals can be satisfying. But archaeology is usually less tidy than that. A society can lack kings without being matriarchal. A settlement can contain female figurines without worshipping one great goddess. Women can be important without being divine symbols. Men can be important without being rulers. Animals can carry more symbolic weight than humans. And clay objects can sit quietly in bins while modern scholars have a century-long debate over them, which is impressive for something small enough to fit in two hands. One of the most interesting things about Çatalhöyük is that, in many lines of evidence, men and women seem to have been treated in broadly similar ways. Burials do not show a dramatic gender-based hierarchy. Diet and health indicators have often been interpreted as suggesting relatively similar access to food. The arrangement of houses does not reveal male-dominated elite spaces. This has led some researchers to argue that gender relations at Çatalhöyük may have been more balanced than in many later hierarchical societies. But balance does not mean goddess-ruled. It does not mean women governed the settlement. It does not mean the mother was the central religious principle. It simply suggests that social difference may not have been organised around sharp gender inequality, at least not in ways that show clearly in the archaeological evidence. This is a subtle but important distinction. Modern people often want the ancient past to provide either a warning or a lost ideal. We look for the first kings to explain domination, or the first goddess to recover harmony. We ask the past to become a mirror for our hopes and disappointments. Çatalhöyük resists that. It does not give us a simple patriarchal state, and it does not give us an easy matriarchal paradise. It gives us a dense household society where bodies, animals, ancestors, food, walls, roofs, and symbols were woven together in ways that do not match our categories neatly. If women and men were treated with a degree of equality, that is fascinating. But it belongs to a particular social system, not to a simple myth of universal mother worship. The figurines may have had many roles. Some could have been ritual objects used in household practices. Some may have been connected to protection, fertility, healing, teaching, storytelling, or the marking of life stages. Some animal figurines may have been used by children, adults, or both. Some human figures may have represented specific kinds of people, ancestors, spirits, or symbolic bodies. Others may have been made and broken as part of temporary acts. A small clay object can be powerful precisely because it is easy to make, hold, carry, hide, break, and discard. Not every sacred thing needs to be monumental. Sometimes a small object has a short life, but a strong purpose. Context matters enormously. If a figurine is found in a grain bin, does that connect it to food storage, fertility, household prosperity, or simple disposal? If it is found in a midden, was it thrown away casually or deposited after use? If it is found broken, was that accident or ritual ending? If it is found near a platform, does it relate to burial, sleeping, domestic space, or all of these? These are the questions that make archaeology both fascinating and mildly frustrating. The object alone rarely tells us enough. It is the object in relation to house, floor, plaster, burial, animal remains, and other deposits that begins to speak. Even then, it tends to speak softly. The mother goddess idea also became popular because it fit a broader story that many people wanted to tell about the Neolithic. Agriculture, fertility, earth, women, birth, grain, settled life. These associations seem naturally connected. A community of early farmers must have been concerned with fertility, of course. Crops had to grow, animals had to reproduce, people had children, the seasons mattered, bodies mattered. But concern with fertility does not automatically produce a mother goddess, and farming life is not only about birth. It is also about labour, storage, risk, hunger, disease, death, repair, weather, and planning. The Neolithic was not a gentle festival of abundance, it was hard work. A goddess of fertility, if one existed, would have had a very full schedule and probably little patience for romantic modern fantasies. There is also a deeper problem with the word goddess. It comes from religious systems we understand through later texts, myths, temples, priests, and named divine personalities. But Çatalhöyük predates writing in the region by millennia. Its symbolic beings may not have been gods and goddesses in a later sense. They may have been ancestors, spirits, powers, animal-human forces, house beings, protective figures, or categories of presence we cannot easily name. To call something a goddess is not necessarily wrong, but it can close the question too early. It gives the figure a title from our vocabulary, then quietly asks the evidence to behave. The evidence at Çatalhöyük tends not to behave. This is especially true because the symbolic life of the site is so deeply tied to houses. If female figurines had meaning, that meaning may have been household-based rather than centred on a public cult. A figurine might belong to a house history, a burial event, a storage practice, a rite of passage, or a seasonal act. It may not have represented a universal deity worshipped across the whole settlement in the same way. Different houses may have used objects differently. Some may have valued animal installations more, others may have maintained certain figurines. Some objects may have moved between houses. Meaning could be local, flexible and changing. Again, the lack of a central temple matters. It suggests that ritual was embedded in domestic life, not necessarily centralised in an organised priesthood. The famous seated woman, then, should perhaps be understood not as the answer to Çatalhöyük, but as one of its questions. She asks us why certain bodies were made in clay. She asks us how age, sex, power, animals, food and household space were connected. She asks why modern viewers are so quick to see motherhood and divinity in a large female body. She asks whether our own assumptions about gender and religion are entering the excavation trench with us, brushing the soil off the object and then accidentally settling on it again. Archaeology is never free from the present. Every generation finds a slightly different Çatalhöyük, because every generation asks different questions. In Melart's time, the goddess interpretation made sense within the intellectual climate, and the evidence then available. Later research did not simply mock that interpretation and move on. It tested it, complicated it, and showed that the site was more varied than the early story suggested. That is how archaeology should work. An interpretation emerges, becomes influential, attracts criticism, meets new evidence, and either changes or fades. The past does not change, but our methods do. More careful excavation, better recording, scientific analyses, and broader theoretical approaches have all made Çatalhöyük less simple, not more. This is progress, even if it ruins a few dramatic book covers. The gender question remains important, though. If Çatalhöyük was not a mother goddess civilization, what does it tell us about women? Quite a lot, though cautiously. The lack of strong evidence for male elite dominance suggests that women may have held substantial social roles. The burial evidence does not show women consistently subordinated. Figurines and imagery indicate that female bodies could carry symbolic importance, even if we do not fully understand how. Domestic space itself, often associated in many societies with women's labour, was at the centre of ritual and memory. If household life was socially central, then the work done in houses was not marginal. Cooking, storing, plastering, childcare, burial care, textile work, food preparation and memory keeping may have been central to the functioning of the settlement. Whether performed by women, men, or both in different combinations, these tasks were not secondary to public power. They were the structure of society. This may be one of Çatalhöyük's quiet challenges to later historical habits. We often separate public power from domestic labour, then value the first more highly because it leaves bigger monuments. Çatalhöyük does not let us do that easily. Its public life may have been on the roofs, but its deepest meanings were inside houses. If power was tied to households, ancestors and ritual interiors, Then domestic work and social authority were intertwined. The mother goddess question may distract from this broader point if we make it only about whether a deity existed. The more interesting issue may be how a society organised meaning around the house, the body, food, death and memory without separating them into public male power and private female labour in the way later societies often did. The figurines also remind us that bodies themselves were symbolic at Çatalhöyük. Human bodies were buried beneath floors, sometimes reopened, sometimes missing skulls, sometimes grouped in ways that do not match simple biological families. Animal bodies were installed in walls. Horns, skulls, teeth, and beaks became architecture. Human-like clay bodies were shaped, handled, and discarded. Bodies, whether human, animal, living, dead, clay, or plaster, were central to how people made meaning. The seated woman belongs to this wider world of bodies. She's not floating alone as a goddess above the settlement. She sits among a whole set of practices that treated bodies as powerful, transformable, and connected to place. There is a reason, though, that people keep returning to her. She has presence. Even if we strip away the confident label of Mother Goddess, the figurine remains compelling. She seems to hold authority. She draws the eye. She makes us wonder who made her and why. Was the maker representing a divine being, a remembered woman, an idealized elder, a powerful ancestor, a mythic figure, or a concept of bodily abundance? Was she used in a ceremony, placed in storage, hidden, displayed, discarded, or deposited after use? Did people look at her with reverence, fear, affection, practicality, or familiarity? We do not know, but the questions are worth more than a false certainty. And maybe that is the best way to handle the Mother Goddess question, not by throwing it away entirely, but by loosening it. The people of Çatalhöyük may well have had powerful female symbols. They may have honoured birth, fertility, age, nourishment, and the generative forces of bodies and fields. Some figurines may have represented beings we might reasonably call goddesses, if we use the word carefully and admit its limits. But the older idea of a single great mother goddess ruling the symbolic life of the settlement now seems too simple. Çatalhöyük's world was broader, stranger, and more house-centred than that. It was not one image. It was a system of walls, floors, bones, animals, food, plaster, memory, and people. The seated woman still matters, but perhaps not because she solves the mystery. She matters because she shows how easily the past can become a screen for modern desire. Some have seen in her proof of ancient matriarchy. Others have seen a fertility cult. Others have seen an elder, an ancestor, or a local household symbol. Each interpretation tells us something about the object and something about the interpreter. That does not make the search hopeless, it makes it honest. Archaeology is not just finding things. It is learning how carefully we must think before we name them. So as we leave the seated woman where she belongs, not as a queen of all answers, but as a small, powerful question made of clay, Çatalhöyük becomes even more interesting. It was not a town ruled by obvious kings, and it was probably not a city devoted simply to a single mother goddess either. It was something harder to categorise. A settlement where houses held the dead, walls held animals, bodies became symbols, and social life seems to have worked without the grand institutions we keep expecting to find. Each time we remove one easy explanation, the site does not become emptier, it becomes richer. And that is why, even after decades of excavation and debate, Çatalhöyük continues to sit on the Konya Plain like a patient reminder that the earliest experiments in settled life were not rough drafts of our own world, but complete and complicated worlds of their own, still refusing, quite politely, to make the kind of sense we keep trying to impose on them. By now, Çatalhöyük has already made several quiet attempts to escape the tidy little boxes we keep preparing for it. We tried to enter it like a town, and it offered us rooftops instead of streets. We tried to find its temples, and it pointed us back into ordinary houses. We looked for kings, chiefs, palaces, and royal tombs, and it gave us mud brick rooms that looked strangely similar from one to the next. We looked under the floors and found the dead. We looked at the walls and found bulls, vultures, leopards, red paint, handprints, and scenes that may be memory, ritual, warning, story, or something else entirely. Then we turned to the famous female figurines, hoping perhaps that a mother goddess might explain what kings could not. And even there, Çatalhöyük raised an eyebrow from beneath 9,000 years of dust and declined to be that simple. UNESCO's site materials describe clustered houses without streets, roof access, symbolic art and burials inside houses, and no evidence so far of large public buildings, ceremonial centres, specialised production areas, or separate cemeteries, which is a remarkably compact way of saying that this place refuses to behave. That refusal is not a flaw in the evidence, it is the heart of the mystery. Çatalhöyük does not fail to make sense because the people who lived there were confused, primitive, or halfway to becoming something more respectable. It fails to make sense because we keep expecting it to fit a sequence that may be too narrow. The usual story says that once people settle down, they farm. Once they farm, they store food. Once they store food, some people control more than others. Once control appears, leaders rise. Leaders build monuments, monuments announce power, and then, after a suitable amount of dust and paperwork, civilization arrives. This story is not completely wrong. It describes many real processes in many places, but Çatalhöyük stands to one side of it, quietly cooking lentils, replastering a wall, and asking whether civilization might have taken more than one path. The first reason it still refuses easy explanation is that it is too large and too organized to dismiss as a simple village, but too lacking in familiar urban features to call a city without hesitation. That is an awkward middle ground. Villages, in the common imagination, are small, loose, and intimate. Cities are large, planned, hierarchical, crowded with public spaces and full of visible institutions. Çatalhöyük is crowded, dense, long-lived, and socially complex, but it does not give us streets, plazas, palaces, or temples in the later sense. It has scale without the expected urban layout. It has continuity without obvious government buildings. It has rich symbolic life without a monumental religious centre. It feels like a city in population and intensity, but like a village in its household-centred structure, and like neither when we actually try to walk through it, because most villages have the common courtesy to provide a path. This in-between quality matters because words shape how we think. If we call Çatalhöyük a city, we may accidentally imagine institutions that are not there. If we call it a village, we may underestimate its size and complexity. If we call it a proto-city, we imply that its main importance is that it was on the way to becoming something else. That may be unfair. Çatalhöyük was not waiting to become Uruk, Memphis, Athens, or Konya. It was not a rehearsal for later civilization. It was itself. It worked for many generations according to its own logic. The fact that we struggle to name it may say more about our categories than about the settlement. The second reason it is difficult is that public life seems to hide inside domestic life. In many archaeological sites, the difference between ordinary houses and special buildings is visible. One structure is bigger, more central, more decorated, or built with unusual materials. It gathers attention. At Çatalhöyük, art, burials, ritual features, production, and daily activity often occur in houses. The Çatalhöyük Research Project describes houses with white plastered walls and floors, wall paintings, platforms, ovens, storage spaces, and symbolic installations such as bullhorns, while also emphasizing the centrality of household spaces in the settlement's life. That means the place where someone cooked food might also be the place where ancestors were buried, and where powerful animals appeared on the walls. The house was not only private, it was not only practical, it was not only sacred, it was all of these at once. Modern categories do not like that. We prefer a kitchen to be a kitchen, a bedroom to be a bedroom, a cemetery to be a cemetery, and a religious building to be clearly marked. preferably with opening hours and a small sign asking visitors not to touch anything. Çatalhöyük seems to have organised meaning differently. A platform could be a resting place for the living and a covering for the dead. A wall could be part of a house and a surface for powerful imagery. A roof could be a roof and a street. A home could be a family space, a memory archive, a ritual setting, and a tomb. Once we accept this, the settlement becomes more understandable, but less familiar. It is not lacking public life. It may be that public significance was distributed through houses rather than gathered into monuments. The third difficulty is that Çatalhöyük offers strong patterns without giving us the stories behind them. We can see repetition. We can see that houses were rebuilt. We can see that some walls were plastered again and again. We can see that people buried bodies beneath floors. We can see animal imagery recurring. We can see differences between buildings, changes across time, and distributions of objects and remains. But we cannot hear the explanations the inhabitants gave one another. No one left a written myth about the vultures. No one recorded a household genealogy explaining why one person was buried beneath a platform and another somewhere else. No child's voice survives to tell us whether the bullhorns were frightening, sacred, ordinary, or simply something adults got very serious about during ceremonies. The evidence is rich, but it is not translated. This is why interpretation at Çatalhöyük has changed so much over time. Early excavations made the site famous through dramatic discoveries and bold interpretations. Later research, with slower excavation methods, scientific analyses and more cautious recording, complicated those early stories. The shift was not simply from wrong to right, as if archaeology were a test with answers in the back of the book. It was a movement from big, confident narratives toward denser, more careful questions. The mother goddess became less certain. The idea of shrines separate from houses became less straightforward. Social equality became more nuanced. Household organisation became more complex. The site did not become less important as interpretations changed. It became more real. That is an important point, because mystery is often sold as a lack of knowledge, when here it is almost the opposite. Çatalhöyük remains mysterious partly because we know so much. If all we had were a few broken walls and a pot, we might create a simple story and leave it there. But Çatalhöyük gives us houses, burials, pigments, animal remains, tools, plant remains, plaster layers, figurines, platforms, hearths, middens, rebuilding sequences, roof evidence, bioarchaeology, landscape studies, and decades of excavation records. Each new kind of evidence adds detail, and detail creates complications. The more closely we look, the less the site behaves like a symbol, and the more it behaves like a real society, which is to say messy, changeable, and full of practices that made sense to the people doing them, even if they did not pause to make them convenient for future documentaries. The fourth reason Çatalhöyük refuses to make sense is that it lasted too long for one explanation. 1,000 years of occupation is not one moment. It is not one culture frozen like a photograph. It is a long sequence of changing habits, inherited forms, experiments, adjustments, and memories. Practices that seem consistent from a distance may have shifted in meaning over time. A burial custom in one period may not have meant exactly the same thing several centuries later. A type of wall image may have been revived, altered, forgotten, or reinterpreted by later generations. Houses may have carried traditions that outlasted the people who understood their origins. This happens in every culture. People continue doing things because they are proper, ancestral, expected, beautiful, useful, lucky, or simply because no one wants to be the first person to stop. Tradition can be very powerful, especially when everyone is watching from the roof next door. This long duration also means that Çatalhöyük was not one society in a simple sense. It was many generations living within a shared architectural and symbolic framework. babies were born into houses that already had histories. Children grew up, learned the roof roots, watched walls being plastered, saw burials sealed beneath floors, and eventually became the adults who repeated or altered those practices. Over time, the settlement rose physically as earlier houses became foundations for later ones. The past was literally underfoot, but each generation must have experienced that past differently. For the earliest inhabitants, the settlement was new. For later inhabitants, it was old, layered, and full of remembered places. That changes how a community understands itself. A house built on fresh ground is not the same as a house built above centuries of buried rooms. The fifth difficulty is that social equality and social difference are both present, but neither is obvious enough to dominate the picture. The houses are broadly similar, and there is no palace. Men and women do not appear to be separated by dramatic differences in burial wealth. There is no clear royal line. Yet there are differences between houses. Some are more elaborately decorated. Some contain more burials. Some seem to have special histories. Some objects and materials would have been more valued than others. Some people surely had more knowledge, influence, or prestige. The society may have been relatively egalitarian compared with later states, but not flat. That is a subtle condition, and subtle conditions are difficult to turn into simple narration. We're used to inequality announcing itself loudly. A gold mask, a huge tomb, a palace wall, a carved name, a poor district beside a wealthy one. Çatalhöyük may have had quieter forms of distinction. A house with many buried dead might matter more. A household that hosted feasts might gain prestige. A person skilled in ritual, building, healing, hunting, or craft might become influential. A group with access to particular materials or stories might hold authority. None of this requires kingship. It does require us to look for power in places that do not look powerful at first. In Çatalhöyük, power may have been built not upward into monuments, but inward into memory and sideways across social relationships. The sixth reason is that the settlement sits at a turning point in human history, but not in a neat way. Çatalhöyük belongs to the Neolithic, the period when many communities were adopting farming, herding, permanent architecture, new food systems, new symbolic practices, and new relationships with land. It is tempting to treat this as the great moment when humans settled down, as though everyone collectively looked at a field one morning and decided that wandering had been lovely, but storage bins were the future. Reality was much more uneven. People continued to hunt wild animals, they gathered wild plants, they farmed and herded, but also depended on older skills. They were settled, but the wild world remained central to their imagery. They lived in dense houses, but painted bulls and vultures on the walls. They stored grain, but installed wild animal horns in domestic rooms. They were not simply farmers replacing hunters. They were people living through a long negotiation between old and new ways of being. That negotiation may be why the animal imagery feels so strong. A community becoming more settled may have needed to keep wild animals symbolically present, not as decoration, but as part of identity, memory, or ritual. Hunting dangerous animals could have continued to matter socially even if farming provided much of the diet. Wild bulls may have been important in feasting or group events. Vultures may have linked death, sky, and transformation. Leopards and other powerful animals may have represented forces outside human control. In this sense, the walls are not contradictions. They are evidence of a society holding different worlds together, the cultivated field and the wild plain, the storage bin and the hunt, the plastered room and the animal body. The seventh difficulty is that Çatalhöyük was not isolated, but it also was not part of a later-style state network. Its people obtained materials from beyond the immediate settlement, including obsidian from volcanic sources, and they participated in broader regional patterns of exchange and knowledge. They were not cut off from the world, yet they did not belong to a written empire, a kingdom, or a city-state. This makes their connections harder to trace. Objects moved, ideas moved, people may have moved, marriage partners, craft skills, stories, ritual practices, and raw materials may have travelled across landscapes that left few written traces because there was no writing. We can map materials and compare sites, but the human relationships behind those movements remain partly hidden. There is something humbling about this. Written history often flatters us into thinking that the important past is the past that spoke in texts. Kings wrote inscriptions, officials kept records, merchants marked accounts, priests copied hymns, but before all that, and alongside it in many places, people lived rich social lives without writing anything down. Their memories were held in bodies, buildings, songs, objects, gestures, and places. Çatalhöyük's people may have known exactly who they were, where they belonged, what the images meant, how the houses should be rebuilt, why the dead were beneath the floors, and which stories were told about the animals on the walls. Their world was not vague to them. It is vague to us because the medium of explanation has vanished. The eighth reason is that the site tempts extreme interpretations. Because it is strange, people want it to be evidence of something dramatic. A lost matriarchy, a goddess civilization, a completely peaceful society. A prehistoric city with hidden urban planning, a ritual centre, a utopian community, a forgotten wisdom tradition. Or, if one wanders into the more adventurous corners of the internet, perhaps something involving ancient visitors who apparently crossed the stars in order to help Neolithic people invent roof access, which seems like a very specialised mission. The real Çatalhöyük does not need exaggeration. It is already remarkable. But its refusal to fit categories makes it vulnerable to stories that are too clean. Good archaeology often moves in the opposite direction. It does not make the site less fascinating. It makes fascination more disciplined. It asks what the evidence actually supports. It separates possibility from probability. It allows uncertainty where uncertainty is honest. It resists filling every gap with a preferred myth. That may be less dramatic than saying we have solved the mystery, but it is much more respectful. The people of Çatalhöyük deserve to be understood as carefully as possible, not turned into props for modern fantasies, however cosy or exciting those fantasies may be. The ninth difficulty is the simplest and perhaps the most important. Çatalhöyük was made by people, and people do not always make perfect sense. We often look at ancient societies as systems, economic systems, ritual systems, architectural systems, burial systems. That is useful. But every system is lived by individuals who have habits, preferences, emotions, mistakes, rivalries, attachments, and memories. A house may follow a standard pattern, but someone still had to repair the oven. A burial may follow custom, but someone still knew the dead person's face. A wall painting may belong to a shared symbolic tradition, but someone still made the marks by hand. A roof route may have been normal, but someone still slipped, complained, laughed, or carried something heavier than they should have. Societies are patterns made of people, and people are wonderfully inconvenient evidence. This is one reason Çatalhöyük remains powerful. It is both deeply strange and deeply ordinary. The strange parts draw us in. No streets, roof entries, house burials, animal walls, no kings, uncertain goddess figures. But the ordinary parts keep it human. Cooking, cleaning, repairing, storing, sleeping, making, feeding children, caring for the dead, managing neighbours, dealing with smoke, carrying water, grinding grain. The extraordinary and the everyday are inseparable. That is not how ancient mystery is usually packaged, but it may be closer to how life actually works. The deepest mysteries are often not hidden in secret chambers. They are built into the routines people repeat until the routines become culture. So when we say Çatalhöyük does not make sense, we should be careful. It does not make immediate sense to us. It does not fit the classic model of early civilization. It does not give us the institutions we expect. It does not divide life into categories we recognize. But it did make sense to the people who lived there. It made enough sense for them to stay, rebuild, bury, paint, work, and pass practices forward for centuries. That is not confusion. That is durability. The question is not whether Çatalhöyük was irrational. The question is whether our own expectations are too narrow to understand forms of social life that did not lead directly toward the state, the palace, or the street grid. Perhaps the most useful way to think about Çatalhöyük is as an experiment in settled life. Not an experiment in the modern scientific sense, with controlled variables and someone writing results on a clipboard. An experiment in the human sense. A community trying over generations to live densely in one place, to manage food and memory, to hold the dead close, to keep wild animals symbolically present, to organize without obvious rulers, and to make houses carry the weight of both daily work and deeper meaning. It was an experiment that lasted a very long time. Then, eventually, it changed and ended, as all human arrangements do. But its remains show us that early settled life was not one path. It was a field of possibilities. And this is where Çatalhöyük becomes more than an archaeological puzzle. It becomes a challenge to the idea that history has one natural direction. We often imagine the past as a staircase, with each step leading upward toward us. Foragers, farmers, villages, cities, states, writing, industry, modern life, and finally someone lying awake watching a video about ancient Anatolia at 1 a.m. But history is not a staircase. It is a landscape of experiments, dead ends, adaptations, continuities and surprises. Çatalhöyük is one of those surprises. It shows that people could build a large, complex, symbolically rich settlement without producing the obvious signs of kingship or public monumentality. It shows that domestic space could hold social meaning at a scale we do not usually expect. It shows that the line between home, tomb, shrine, workshop, and memory place can be far thinner than our categories allow. There is also a quiet warning here for anyone trying to interpret ancient life too quickly. Absence is not always absence. The lack of palaces does not mean lack of power. The lack of temples does not mean lack of ritual. The lack of streets does not mean lack of public movement. The lack of writing does not mean lack of history. Çatalhöyük teaches us to look for evidence in unfamiliar forms. Power may be in the house, ritual may be on the wall, public space may be on the roof. History may be under the platform. A community may be organized through memory rather than monuments. At the same time, presence is not always proof. A female figurine does not automatically prove a goddess cult. A bullhorn does not automatically explain religion. A painted scene does not automatically tell us its story. A similar house plan does not prove perfect equality. A burial beneath a floor does not mean the same thing in every generation. Çatalhöyük asks us to hold evidence carefully, neither ignoring it nor forcing it to speak more clearly than it can. That is why the site still refuses to make sense in the best possible way. It keeps us from becoming too comfortable. It reminds us that ancient people were not simple versions of ourselves, and not mysterious creatures beyond understanding either. They were human beings living within worlds of meaning that partly overlap with ours and partly do not. We can understand their need for food, shelter, belonging, memory and social order. We can understand the care involved in burying the dead, the labour of maintaining houses, the importance of animals, the pull of tradition, and the difficulty of living close to other people. But we cannot fully recover their stories, their names, their jokes, their fears, their exact beliefs, or the way a child felt looking at painted animals in firelight. Some distance remains, and that distance is not failure. It is the shape of deep time. In the end, Çatalhöyük's mystery is not that it is impossible. It is that it was possible. A town without streets worked, houses as tombs worked, ritual without temples worked, social coordination without obvious kings worked. A dense community built from mud brick, plaster, ladders, memory and shared practice endured on the Konya plain for centuries. That is the part that should make us pause. The site does not make sense if civilization must look like hierarchy, monumentality, and central control. It begins to make sense if civilization, or something close to it, can also look like households stitched together across roofs, ancestors beneath floors, animals watching from walls, and a community held together by customs strong enough to leave a mound behind. And even after we have said all this, the mound remains quieter than our explanations. It does not argue. It does not correct us. It simply sits there, layered and patient, beneath the Anatolian sky. The wind moves over the plain. The modern shelters protect the excavated areas. Visitors walk where ancient roofs once formed pathways. Archaeologists continue to study fragments of bone, plaster, seed, pigment and wall. Each discovery adds another detail, and each detail makes the place not smaller, but larger. Çatalhöyük still refuses to become a simple story. It keeps its complexity, which may be the most honest thing any ancient place can do. So perhaps we should stop asking why Çatalhöyük does not make sense, and ask instead what kind of sense it makes. Not the sense of a palace plan or a king list. Not the sense of a tidy origin story. A household sense. A rooftop sense. A sense built from repetition, closeness, burial, repair, food, memory, animals, and the ongoing work of living together. It is a kind of sense that does not shout from monuments, but waits beneath plaster and dust. And as we move toward the end of this journey, that may be where the deepest mystery lies, not in one object or one painting, but in the quiet remains of an entire way of life that was once ordinary to those who lived it and is still strange enough, after 9,000 years, to make us question what we thought civilization had to be. Beneath all the arguments, all the careful measurements, all the wall paintings, burials, figurines, roof ladders, plaster layers, animal horns, and unanswered questions, Çatalhöyük remains something very simple and very difficult at the same time. It was a place where people lived. That may sound almost too obvious to say, but it is worth returning to because ancient sites can become so famous for what makes them strange that we forget what made them possible. Before Çatalhöyük was a mystery, it was home. Before it was a mound on the Konya plain, it was a settlement of rooms, roofs, smoke, food, children, bodies, tools, stories, habits, and repairs. Before archaeologists gave names to buildings and counted plaster layers, someone was kneeling by a hearth, someone was grinding grain, someone was climbing a ladder with tired legs, someone was smoothing wet plaster on a wall, and someone was wondering whether the weather would hold long enough to finish whatever needed doing that day. This is where the quiet mystery begins to feel different from the louder kind. There is no single locked chamber waiting to be opened. No lost inscription that will suddenly explain everything. No golden mask with a ruler's name. No dramatic temple door. No final clue that turns the whole settlement into a solved puzzle. Çatalhöyük is not that kind of mystery. It is quieter, more stubborn, and in some ways more human. Its secrets are not hidden because someone deliberately concealed them. They are hidden because ordinary life leaves traces unevenly. A wall survives, but not the voice that explained the painting on it. A skeleton remains, but not the grief, duty, or ceremony that placed it beneath the floor. A roof entrance can be reconstructed, but not the 1,000 small gestures of people climbing through it without thinking that this was unusual. The deeper we look, the more we realize that the missing parts are not small. They are the parts that would have made the place feel alive, and yet enough remains to make the settlement almost unbearably vivid. We can picture the roofscape at dawn, not as a grand city skyline, but as a spread of mud brick surfaces warming slowly under the Anatolian sun. Smoke begins to rise from openings in the roofs. A person emerges, then another. Ladders creak. Baskets are moved. A child is reminded, perhaps sharply, to watch where they are stepping. Someone carries food. Someone repairs a roof surface that has cracked. Someone calls across to a neighbour. There are no streets below, no carts rattling along lanes, no palace rising over the houses. The town wakes from above. Its pathways are roofs, its doorways are holes in the ceiling. Its public life is spread across the tops of homes, and its private life waits below in plastered rooms. Inside those rooms, the air is dimmer. The light drops from above, touching the walls, platforms, hearth, storage bins, and the surfaces that have been renewed many times by hand. The house is practical. It has work to do. Food must be cooked, grain must be processed, tools must be kept, fires must be managed, children must sleep somewhere, bodies must rest. But the house is also full of memory. Beneath the floor are the dead, not far away in a cemetery, not outside the settlement boundary, but under the places where daily life continues. This detail still has the power to unsettle us, though perhaps it should also humble us. To the people of Çatalhöyük, the dead may not have been distant. They may have belonged to the household in a way that continued after burial. The living walked above them, slept above them, worked above them, and in doing so kept them within the structure of life. The walls, too, were not neutral. Bulls, vultures, leopards, bears, patterns, handprints, and red marks appeared on plastered surfaces. Some were visible for a time, then covered. Some were renewed. Some were altered when houses were closed. The images did not stand apart from daily life, protected in separate sacred buildings. They lived in rooms where smoke gathered, food was prepared, and people came and went through roof openings. A bull's horns set into a wall would not have been an art object in the museum sense. It was part of the room, part of the house's presence. It projected into human space with the force of an animal that had once lived beyond the settlement, in the wild world of danger, skill, and memory. The wolves were watching, not in a magical sense we can prove, but in the simple physical sense that the animals were there, fixed in plaster, sharing space with the living. There is something important about that combination. At Çatalhöyük, the settled world did not erase the wild world. People farmed and herded, but they still filled their rooms with wild animals. They built dense houses but remembered the hunt. They stored food but honoured creatures that could not be domesticated in any easy way. They created a community that seems, to us, unusually settled, yet its symbolic life kept turning toward animals, death, and transformation. Perhaps this was one of the ways people made sense of a changing life. Farming did not simply replace older relationships with the landscape, it mixed with them. The field and the marsh, the herd and the wild bull, the grain bin and the vulture, the house and the burial all belong to one world. And still, we have to be careful. That is one of the lessons of Çatalhöyük. It teaches caution. The famous seated woman may be a goddess, or an ancestor, or an elder, or something else entirely. The wall painting, sometimes called a map, may be a map, or a landscape, or a volcano, or a leopard skin, or a design whose meaning sits somewhere outside our categories. The houses may suggest equality, but not perfect sameness. The absence of kings may mean distributed power, not the absence of power. The burials beneath floors may represent family, but not always biological family. Again and again, the site invites interpretation and then gently pulls away from certainty. It gives us evidence, but not a script. It lets us see the stage, the props, the walls, the floors, and sometimes the bodies, but the spoken lines are gone. That is not a reason to give up. It is a reason to listen more carefully to what the evidence can actually say. Çatalhöyük tells us that people lived densely in one place for a very long time. It tells us they entered houses from above, maintained plastered interiors, buried many of their dead beneath floors, created symbolic images inside homes, used wild animal parts in striking ways, and organised a large community without leaving behind obvious signs of kings, palaces, or formal temples. These are not small facts. They are enough to change how we think about early settled life. The problem comes when we try to force them into a single neat explanation. A goddess city, a peaceful utopia, a proto-city, a village, a cult centre, a failed state. Each label catches part of the truth and drops the rest. Perhaps Çatalhöyük is most useful when we let it remain difficult. Not vague, not mystical for its own sake, but difficult in the way real human societies are difficult. We know this from the present. No living town can be fully explained by its buildings alone. Imagine someone 9,000 years from now digging through a modern apartment block. They might find kitchens, beds, cables, children's toys, pet bowls, broken mugs, religious objects, medicine bottles, photographs, receipts, and the mysterious drawer of tangled charges that future scholars may rightly fear. They could learn a great deal. But would they understand the family arguments, the private jokes, the loneliness of one resident, the routine of another, the reason one room was painted blue, the way a person paused at a window every evening? Some things survive, others dissolve almost immediately. Archaeology is powerful, but it is always reaching across absence. At Çatalhöyük, that absence has a special thickness because the settlement predates writing. There are no names, no personal letters, no official lists, no prayers preserved in script, no myth telling us why the vulture mattered. The people who lived there are present through their actions, not their words. We know them by what they built, buried, painted, repaired, ate, carried, shaped, broke, and left behind. This makes them feel both close and distant. Close, because their lives were made of recognizable human needs. Distant, because the meanings they attach to those needs are partly lost. We can understand hunger, we can understand shelter, we can understand grief, we can understand the desire to remember the dead. But we cannot fully enter the world in which a plastered bull skull belonged on the wall of a house, above buried bodies beneath the floor, and maybe that distance is not something to erase, maybe it is something to respect. The people of Çatalhöyük were not primitive versions of us waiting for history to improve them. They were not symbols of some lost golden age. They were not a riddle designed for modern people to solve. They were communities of human beings living successfully, though not easily, in a particular place under particular conditions, with their own knowledge, fears, customs, and expectations. Their world made sense to them. That is the important thing. It lasted. It held together. It changed over time, as all human worlds do, but it endured long enough to leave a mound behind. A mound made not of conquest or royal ambition, but of houses built over houses, floors laid above floors, lives layered upon lives. There is something almost gentle about the way the settlement became a mound. No single person commanded it into being. No architect designed the whole thing from above, at least as far as we can tell. It rose because people stayed, because walls needed rebuilding, because old houses were filled and new ones made, because families, households, or social groups returned to familiar places, because the dead were placed beneath floors and the living kept living above them, because plaster was renewed, roofs were repaired, and rooms were closed. Over centuries, ordinary repetition became geology. Human habit became a hill. And now that hill sits in the plain, excavated in places, protected in places, still unexcavated in others. Archaeologists continue to study what remains, but much of Çatalhöyük is still beneath the surface. That is fitting. A site like this should not give everything away at once. Even the excavated areas represent only part of the settlement, part of its history, part of its many lives. Each trench opens a window, but not the whole house. Each discovery adds detail, but also more questions. A burial raises questions about kinship. A painting raises questions about belief. A figurine raises questions about gender and symbolism. A house sequence raises questions about continuity. Nothing sits alone. Everything connects, and the connections are where the mystery thickens. When we look back over the whole journey, it becomes clear that Çatalhöyük is not strange because it is impossible to understand. It is strange because it is possible in a way we did not expect. a dense settlement without streets. Homes entered through roofs, dead buried beneath living spaces, wild animals brought into plastered rooms, a large community without obvious kings, symbolic life without monumental temples, houses as the main units of memory, ritual and social identity. Each of these elements makes sense on its own after a while. Together they create a world that is coherent but unfamiliar, like hearing a language whose grammar is steady but whose words we only partly know. This is why the title, The Ancient Civilization That Does Not Make Sense, needs a soft correction by the end. It does not make sense only if we assume civilization must look a certain way. It does not make sense if we expect streets, kings, temples, and clear social ranks to appear as soon as people gather in large numbers. It does not make sense if we believe the past should line up neatly behind the present, each society becoming a rough draft of what came later. But if we allow that humans have tried many ways of living together, then Çatalhöyük begins to make a different kind of sense. Not simple sense, not complete sense, but a household sense, a roofscape sense, a memory sense. A way of life built from closeness, repetition, and shared practices strong enough to keep thousands of people connected across generations. And that may be the deepest gift of the site. It widens the imagination. It reminds us that human history was not a single road. It was a branching landscape of experiments. Some led to kingdoms and empires. Some led to villages that moved and changed. Some led to dense settlements like Çatalhöyük, where people gathered in large numbers but did not build the kind of authority structures we expect. The mound on the Konya Plain is proof that the human story is broader than our usual categories. Civilization, if we choose to use the word, did not have one shape at the beginning. It had many possible shapes, and some of them had no streets. There is also a quieter, more personal lesson in that. We often live as if our own arrangements are natural and inevitable. Houses should have front doors, streets should run between buildings. Cemeteries should be separate. Public buildings should be distinct from homes. Power should be visible in offices, capitals, monuments or titles. Çatalhöyük gently reminds us that these are choices, not laws of nature. Human beings can organize space, memory, death, and authority in radically different ways, and still create a lasting community. The people of Çatalhöyük did not need our categories to live meaningful lives. They had their own. So as we leave the mound behind, it is worth imagining it one last time, not as a puzzle in a textbook, but as an evening settlement. The sun lowers over the plain. The roofs cool after the heat of the day. Smoke thins above the openings. People descend into their houses. Food is prepared. Tools are set down. Children grow sleepy. The walls hold their painted animals in the dim light. Beneath the platforms, the dead remain close. Somewhere, a ladder is pulled slightly aside. Somewhere, plaster dries. Somewhere, a story is told that we will never hear, about a bull, a bird, a house, a person, or a time before the mound rose so high. Those stories are gone, but not everything is gone. The settlement remains in fragments, and fragments can be generous if we approach them with patience. A handprint on plaster, a skull beneath a floor, a horn set into a wall, a platform repaired again and again, a roof opening where light once entered. These are small things compared with pyramids or palaces, but they have a different power. They do not tell us what rulers wanted remembered. They show us what repeated life left behind. And so, dear listener, we arrive at the edge of this ancient town without streets, carrying more questions than answers, which is probably the honest way to leave Çatalhöyük. We have walked across its imagined rooftops, climbed down into its houses, looked beneath its floors, studied its walls, wondered about its animals, searched for kings, questioned its goddesses, and found again and again that the past is more inventive than our expectations. If this quiet journey through mud brick, memory and mystery has given you a little calm, a little curiosity, or simply a strange new appreciation for the ancient practicality of roof entrances, I'd be grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this small corner of calm reach others who might enjoy drifting through the deep past at a slower pace. And before you go, or before sleep carries you off entirely, let me ask you once more gently, where are you listening from tonight? And if you had lived in Çatalhöyük, what do you think would have stayed with you most? The rooftops under your feet, the animals on the walls, the ancestors beneath the floor, or simply the knowledge that home could mean something far deeper, stranger, and older than we usually imagine? The mound still rests on the Konya plain, quiet beneath the sky, holding what remains of a world that once made perfect sense to those who lived inside it. We may never understand every painting, every burial, every figurine, or every choice built into those mud brick rooms, but perhaps we do not need to solve it completely to feel its importance. Sometimes the past does not give us answers. Sometimes it gives us better questions. And Çatalhöyük, patient beneath its layers of dust, gives us one of the best questions of all. What other ways of being human have we forgotten how to imagine? Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are, under whatever roof shelters you tonight. Somewhere far away in time, another roof once held footsteps, smoke, voices, and the warm weight of a human world now resting quietly beneath the earth.